There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a hospital room when the people who are supposed to love you have decided, without ever saying it out loud, that you have become inconvenient. It is not the silence of sleep. It is not even the silence of grief. It is the silence of calculation, and once you have heard it, you never mistake it for anything else again. I am Emma Whitfield. I am 34 years old, and 10 years ago, on a rain-soaked October night, my family walked out of a hospital corridor in Denver, Colorado, and did not come back. Not the next morning, not the next week. Not in any way that mattered for almost a decade. Last month, my father called me for the first time in 9 years. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask if I could walk again, or whether the surgeries had worked, or whether I had forgiven him. He asked me to sign a document that would save the family business from collapse, and he asked it in the same tone he used to use when he told me to fetch his newspaper from the driveway. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 10 years building something so much larger than the thing they were trying to save that his phone call felt, to me, like a man standing at the base of a mountain, shouting up at a cloud, certain the cloud could still hear him. This is the story of how I became a stranger to my own family, and how, in becoming a stranger, I became myself. To understand what happened at that hospital, you have to understand the Whitfield family the way I understood it growing up, which is to say, as a hierarchy disguised as a household. My father, Richard Whitfield, inherited Whitfield and Sons Construction from his own father, my grandfather Walter, a stubborn, sharp-eyed man who had built the company from a single flatbed truck and a box of hand tools in 1962 into one of the largest mid-sized commercial construction firms in the Mountain West. By the time I was born, the company employed nearly 400 people across 3 states, and the Whitfield name meant something in Denver. Steel-framed office parks, hospital wings, a stretch of the airport expansion. My father wore that name like a crown, and he made sure his children understood, from the earliest age, that the crown came with a line of succession. My older brother, Tyler, was the heir apparent from the moment he was born, simply by virtue of being born first and being born male. My father used to introduce him at company barbecues as the future of Whitfield and Sons, and Tyler, even at 12 years old, would straighten his little collared shirt and nod like a prince accepting a beau. My younger sister, Chloe, was the family's showpiece, beautiful in the effortless way that made adults stop talking to compliment her. Later, the kind of beautiful that got her homecoming queen and a full-ride modeling contract offer she never took because my father decided modeling was beneath the family name. Chloe didn't have to fight for attention. Attention arrived at her door like mail. And then there was me, Emma, the middle child, the quiet one, the one who liked numbers more than people, who spent her allowance on second-hand programming books instead of clothes, who got straight A's that nobody mentioned at dinner because straight A's were what was expected of me, not what was celebrated in me. I was not neglected, exactly. My mother, Diane, made sure I had clean clothes and hot meals and a signature on every school form. But I was managed. I was maintained. I was the middle shelf in a house built for the top and bottom shelves to shine. I used to tell myself that this was fine, that some children are simply born into supporting roles, and the trick to a happy life is learning to play your role well. I told myself this through high school, through the 2 years of community college my father allowed me before deciding my engineering hobby needed to give way to something more practical through the entry-level bookkeeping job at Whitfield and Sons that he gave me, not because he believed in me, but because it was easier to keep an eye on a daughter who worked down the hall than one who wandered off into a life he couldn't supervise. I was 24 years old on the night everything changed, and I was, by every outward measure, exactly the daughter my family had shaped me to be. obedient, useful, and almost entirely invisible. The night of the accident, we were driving home from Chloe's engagement party. She had just gotten engaged to Preston Cole, the son of one of my father's biggest commercial clients, and the party had been less a celebration of love than a merger announcement dressed up in string lights and champagne. My father had toasted the union like a business acquisition. Two families, two legacies, one incredible future, he'd said, raising his glass. And I remember watching Chloe glow under the attention while I refilled the ice bucket because someone needed to, and nobody else had noticed it was empty. I was driving my mother's car because mine was in the shop. Chloe was in the passenger seat, scrolling through engagement photos people had already posted, narrating each comment out loud. My mother called my cell phone 4 times in 11 minutes, because she'd left her sunglasses at the venue and wanted me to turn around and get them before the staff cleaned up. I told her I couldn't talk while driving. She called again and again. On the 5th call, I reached for the phone on the passenger seat, just to silence it, just for 1 second. And in that 1 second, a delivery truck ran a red light on Colfax Avenue and hit the driver's side of the car going 45 miles per hour. I don't remember most of what happened next. I remember the sound, which was less a crash than a single enormous physical word, a sound that seemed to come from inside my own skull. I remember Chloe screaming. I remember the airbag, and then I remember nothing at all until I woke up in a hospital bed 4 days later with 2 shattered vertebrae, a fractured pelvis, internal bleeding that had required emergency surgery to control, and a spinal cord injury that the neurologist described in the careful, rehearsed language doctors use when they are about to change your entire life as incomplete but severe. Translation: I might walk again. I might not. Nobody could promise me anything except that the next year of my life would be measured in surgeries, in physical therapy sessions, in a hospital bed that I would come to know better than I had ever known my childhood bedroom. Chloe walked away from the accident with a broken wrist and a mild concussion. She was released the same night. I have thought, many times since, about the particular cruelty of a universe that let the golden child walk away, nearly untouched, while it broke the middle daughter into pieces that would take a decade to reassemble. But I no longer believe it was cruelty. I believe it was simply physics. I was in the seat closer to the impact. And I believe that what happened afterward, in the weeks and months that followed, had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with the people my family had always been, revealed now under a pressure they had never before been tested by. Because it is one thing to raise a middle child who fills the ice bucket without being asked. It is another thing entirely to find out what that family does when the middle child can no longer fill anything at all, when she can no longer walk, or work, or contribute, or shrink herself into convenience. I found out. And it broke something in me that never grew back the same shape it had been before. But it also, though I could not have known it then, cleared the ground for something entirely new to grow. For the first 2 weeks, my family visited every day. I want to be fair about that, because fairness matters to me even now, even after everything. My mother sat by my bed reading gossip magazines aloud in a bright, forced voice. My father stood near the window with his arms crossed like he was inspecting a job site, and even Tyler came by once or twice, his cast still on his wrist, mumbling something about how the truck driver's insurance company was going to pay for this. It was during the 3rd week, when the hospital's financial counselor sat my parents down to discuss the actual cost of my care, that I began to understand something was shifting. I was not in the room for that meeting. I was in physical therapy, learning how to shift my own weight in a bed without a nurse's help, which at the time felt like the single hardest thing I had ever done in my life. But my mother told me about it later, in the careful, sideways way she told me anything unpleasant, framing it as information rather than warning. "The insurance is going to cover most of it," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "But there's a gap. A big one. Your father's talking to the lawyers about the delivery company's insurance, but that could take years to settle. Years, Emma." I didn't understand then what she was preparing me for. I thought she was simply worried, the way any mother would be worried about a daughter's medical bills. I didn't yet understand that in my family, worry and resentment often wore the same face. The visits started thinning out in week 4. My father stopped coming altogether, citing the Meridian Project, a new office tower that Whitfield and Sons had just broken ground on downtown. A project I would later learn that my father had bid aggressively low to win, stretching the company's cash reserves thinner than they had been in a decade. My mother still came, but her visits shortened from hours to minutes, and she started arriving with paperwork instead of magazines, forms for me to sign, releases, insurance documents, things she said just needed my signature, that I, drugged on pain medication and exhausted from therapy, signed without reading as carefully as I should have. It was in week 6 that Chloe stopped visiting entirely. She had a wedding to plan. Preston's family had moved the date up. Some tax reason, some scheduling reason. I never fully understood it. And suddenly, my sister's entire universe narrowed to venue tastings and dress fittings, and there was, apparently, no room in that universe for a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and bad news. I remember the exact moment I understood what was actually happening. It was early in week 7. My mother came to visit, and she was distracted, checking her phone every few minutes. And when I asked her what was wrong, she said, and I remember this with a clarity that has never faded, not once in 10 years. "Emma, honey, I need you to understand something. Your father and I have been talking to a financial advisor, and the truth is, the amount of money this is going to cost, long term, the ongoing therapy, the possibility of a wheelchair, the home modifications if you can't walk. It's a lot. It's more than we planned for. And we still have Tyler's wedding to save for eventually, and Chloe's is happening now. And the Meridian Project needs capital, and I need you to understand that we can't do everything." I asked her what that meant. What "can't do everything" meant, specifically, for me, lying in a hospital bed with 2 rods and 11 screws holding my spine together. She told me that the doctors had recommended a long-term rehabilitation facility, a good one, she assured me, one of the best in the state, but that it was a step down from the hospital, more of a transitional care environment. She told me this like it was a comfort. She did not tell me, not that day, that the facility she meant was a state-subsidized long-term care center 40 minutes outside Denver, chronically understaffed, a place my father's insurance would barely cover and my family would not supplement. She did not tell me, that day, that they had also, quietly, without asking me, using the power of attorney I had signed while sedated and calling it just a formality for the insurance paperwork, begun the process of listing my portion of my grandfather's small trust as collateral against the Meridian Project's construction loan. My grandfather Walter had died 2 years before the accident and left each of his 3 grandchildren a modest trust, not large, perhaps $80,000 each, meant for things like a first house or a wedding. Mine, apparently, was about to become collateral for an office tower I would never set foot in. I want to be honest about something. I did not scream. I did not cry, not in front of her. I had spent 24 years learning how to absorb disappointment quietly, how to make myself small and manageable in a house that only had room for 2 large personalities. And even in that hospital bed, broken in ways I did not yet fully understand, some old and deeply worn part of me simply nodded and said, "Okay, Mom, whatever you think is best." She kissed my forehead and told me she loved me, and I believed her, because I did not yet understand that a person can love you, and also, when it becomes inconvenient, decide that you are a cost to be minimized rather than a person to be shown up for. I was transferred to Meadow Ridge Transitional Care Center on a Tuesday morning in early December. My father did not come. My mother came, signed the intake papers, kissed my forehead again, and left within 20 minutes, telling me she had a meeting about the Cole Whitfield wedding registry. My sister's wedding, still months away, already occupying more of my mother's calendar than her daughter's spine. Chloe never visited Meadow Ridge, not once. Tyler visited exactly one time, 3 weeks after I arrived, and spent most of the visit on his phone, texting someone and laughing quietly to himself, while I lay in a bed with a roommate named Dolores, who screamed for her dead husband every night around 3 a.m. He left after 40 minutes, telling me he had a thing, and I never saw him again in that facility. My father visited 0 times. Not once in the 11 months I spent at Meadow Ridge, learning to sit up on my own, learning to transfer myself from bed to wheelchair without assistance, because the staff-to-patient ratio meant help often took 20 minutes to arrive, learning to manage pain that no medication fully touched, learning. This is the part that still catches in my throat. Even now. Learning to stop expecting the door to open and see someone I loved walk through it. Did my father visit 0 times? I have gone back over that sentence in my memory more times than I can count, checking it for error, hoping I misremembered. I did not misremember. In 11 months, the man who had raised me, who had walked me down 100 imaginary aisles in his own head when I was small, who had taught me to ride a bike in a church parking lot when I was 6, did not once make the 40-minute drive to see whether his daughter was alive. What I did not know then, what I would only learn 10 years later, in a conversation that would rearrange everything I thought I understood about that year, was that my father had, in fact, been to Meadow Ridge exactly once. Not to see me. To meet in the parking lot with a lawyer to finalize the paperwork transferring guardianship of my financial affairs, using a durable power of attorney he had quietly upgraded while I was still recovering from surgery, into something far more permanent than just a formality for the insurance paperwork. He had come to that building once, and he had left without walking through the front doors. Meadow Ridge Transitional Care Center was not a cruel place, exactly. It was an underfunded place, which is its own particular kind of cruelty, dressed up in beige walls and an activities calendar nobody had the staff to actually run. The nurses were kind when they had time to be kind, which was not often. The food was the kind of food that makes you grateful for hunger's absence rather than its satisfaction. And the days moved so slowly that I sometimes measured them not in hours, but in the small, humiliating increments of physical therapy. The first time I moved my left big toe on command, 3 weeks in, felt like landing on the moon. I want to tell you that I found strength immediately, that I rose from that hospital bed like some kind of phoenix. But that would be a lie. And I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever told this story, I would tell it honestly. The truth is that for the first 4 months at Meadow Ridge, I was, in every sense that mattered, disappearing. I stopped eating more than I had to. I stopped speaking more than I had to. I lay in that bed and replayed my mother's voice. "We can't do everything," on a loop so constant that it started to feel less like a memory and more like the weather, something ambient and inescapable that simply existed around me now. I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightens me still, that if I simply stopped trying, stopped eating, stopped doing the excruciating physical therapy exercises, stopped fighting for whatever life I had left, nobody would come to stop me. Nobody would even notice quickly enough to matter. What saved me, and I do not use that word lightly, was a man in room 114. His name was Salvatore Alvarez, and he was 78 years old. A retired structural engineer who had spent 40 years designing bridges across the American Southwest before a stroke left the right side of his body weakened and put him in Meadow Ridge for what was supposed to be 6 months of rehabilitation, and had turned, by the time I met him, into nearly 2 years, because his own family, as it happened, was almost as absent as mine. We met in the shared physical therapy gym, both of us assigned to the same afternoon slot. Both of us, I would learn, abandoned in nearly identical ways, though his story had unfolded over years rather than months. His son lived in Seattle and called on birthdays. His daughter had her own family to think about. He told me this without bitterness, in a flat, matter-of-fact voice, the voice of a man who had made peace with a fact long before I had made peace with my own version of it. And something about his calm, unhurried honesty cracked something open in me that 6 weeks of hospital-mandated grief counseling had not managed to touch. "You keep waiting for the door," he said to me one afternoon, watching me stare at the entrance to the therapy gym for the third time in 10 minutes, though nobody was due to visit either of us. "I used to do that too. You have to stop, Miha. Not because they don't matter. Because you matter more, and the waiting is eating you alive faster than the accident ever could." I asked him how he stopped waiting. "I gave myself something else to wait for," he said. For Salvatore, that something else had been mathematics. Specifically, the stock market, which he had studied obsessively since his retirement, using an old laptop his physical therapist had helped him set up, tracking companies the way he used to track load-bearing calculations, with the same rigorous, patient attention. He showed me his spreadsheets one afternoon, color-coded and meticulous, tracking a small portfolio he'd built from his engineering pension, and I remember looking at the numbers and feeling, for the first time in months, something other than grief. I felt curious. I told him I used to study programming before my father decided it was impractical. I told him I had 2 years of community college credits in computer science that I'd never finished, that I had once dreamed, quietly, privately, the way you dream about things you've been taught not to want out loud, of building software, real software, the kind that solved actual problems instead of just balancing my father's books. "So finish it," he said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "I can't afford tuition," I told him. "I can't even afford my own physical therapy co-pays right now." "I didn't say pay for a degree," he said. "I said finish learning. There's a difference, and it's a difference that matters more than any piece of paper. The internet has more free education in it than either of us could consume in 10 lifetimes. You have time. God knows we both have time." He gestured at the gym around us, at the beige walls, at the slow parade of days. "Use it before it uses you." That night, I asked one of the kinder nurses, a woman named Priya who had noticed, I think, the particular flavor of my loneliness, if there was any way to get internet access in my room. She came back 2 days later with an old tablet her nephew had stopped using, already loaded with a cheap data plan she paid for herself, and told me, in a voice that brooked no argument, that I was to tell no one where it came from, because Meadow Ridge had rules about outside donations that she did not feel like enforcing today. I have never forgotten that tablet. I still have it, actually, in a drawer in my office, because there are some objects that stop being objects and become instead a kind of proof. Proof that even in the loneliest chapter of your life, the universe occasionally sends you a stranger with exactly the thing you need and asks for nothing in return except that you not waste it. I started with free coding tutorials, then online courses. Then, 6 months in, small freelance jobs I found on a gig platform, building simple websites for local businesses for $50, then $100, then $200. typing with 2 fingers because my hands still shook from nerve damage, propped up on pillows because sitting upright for more than 20 minutes still exhausted me. Working in the dead hours of the night when Dolores had finally stopped screaming for her husband, and the facility had gone quiet enough for me to think. Salvatore taught me to read a balance sheet. I taught him, badly at first, how to build a simple spreadsheet macro that would flag stocks matching his criteria automatically, so he didn't have to scan them by hand every morning with his weakened right hand trembling on the keyboard. We became, in the truest sense of the word, partners in survival. 2 people the world had quietly filed under no longer relevant, building in a beige room with bad food and worse Wi-Fi, the first tools of 2 entirely different comebacks. I did not know yet that mine would eventually become a company worth more than my father's entire construction empire. I did not know that Salvatore's small, meticulous portfolio would become, within 4 years, the seed capital for my first real business. I did not know any of it yet. I only knew that for the first time since the accident, I had something to wait for that did not involve a door that never opened. I was discharged from Meadow Ridge in November of the following year, 11 months after I'd arrived, walking with a cane and a limp that would never fully disappear, but walking. The neurologist who had once given me only a cautious might now called it, with something close to wonder in her voice, one of the more remarkable recoveries I've documented in a patient with your injury profile. I remember not feeling wonder. I remember feeling only a grim, private satisfaction, the satisfaction of a person who has clawed something back from a universe that tried to take it, with almost no help from the people who were supposed to give it. I called my mother the day I was discharged. I did not expect a celebration, but I expected, at minimum, a ride home. "Oh, Emma, that's wonderful," she said, and I could hear, in the background, the unmistakable sound of a bridal boutique, fabric rustling, a saleswoman's bright professional voice, my sister's laugh. "We're actually at Chloe's final dress fitting right now. It's just impossible timing. Can you get a cab? We'll pay you back." They never paid me back. It was $11. I remember the exact amount because I remember counting it out of the small stack of freelance earnings I'd saved. Cash I had been planning to use for my first month's rent on the studio apartment I'd found. Cheap, above a laundromat. But mine. The first thing that had been entirely mine since the accident. It was in packing up my old bedroom at my parents' house. I stayed there for exactly 6 days, sleeping on a blow-up mattress because my old room had been converted, without any conversation with me, into Chloe's overflow closet for wedding gifts. That I discovered what else had happened while I was gone. My grandfather's trust, the $80,000 that had been meant for me, gone. Not spent frivolously, I want to be fair. It had gone, as my mother had hinted in that hospital room, into the Meridian Project, listed as collateral against a construction loan that Whitfield and Sons had needed to keep from defaulting during a cash crunch. My father had, in the year I was recovering, used the durable power of attorney I had signed while sedated on painkillers to liquidate my trust and fold it into the company's capital, alongside, I would later discover, Tyler's trust, which Tyler had willingly signed over, because Tyler, unlike me, had been in the room for that conversation, had understood what was happening, and had agreed to it because he expected to inherit the company someday anyway. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had explained it to me until it was already done. When I finally confronted my father about it, sitting at the kitchen table in the house I'd grown up in, my cane resting against the chair beside me, he did not apologize. "It was going to be your money someday anyway, Emma," he said, not looking up from the newspaper he was reading. "The company is the family's future. You'll benefit from it eventually, when it's bigger and stronger. Think of it as an investment instead of a withdrawal." "It was supposed to be for me," I said, "not for the company. For me. A house. A start. You're being dramatic, he said. You have a roof over your head right now, don't you? I looked around that kitchen. The kitchen where I had done my homework as a child, while my mother made dinner for a family that would eventually leave me alone in a hospital bed for 11 months. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, like a door swinging shut somewhere deep in my chest, that I was not going to get an apology. Not that day, and possibly not ever. My father did not see what he had done as a betrayal. He saw it as a reasonable allocation of family resources, and in his mind, I suspected, he always would. I moved out 6 days after being discharged from Meadow Ridge. I took a studio apartment above a laundromat on the east side of Denver, 420 square feet, a mattress on the floor, a card table for a desk, and the tablet Priya had given me, upgraded now to a second-hand laptop I'd bought with 3 months of freelance earnings. I did not tell my family where I had moved. When my mother asked in the weeks that followed, I gave vague answers. I'm settling in somewhere. I'll send you the address once I'm unpacked. And I never did send it. Not because I was angry, though I was, in a slow-burning way that had not yet found its full shape, but because some quiet, self-protective instinct in me understood, even then, that if I gave them my address, I would spend the rest of my life waiting for them to use it, and I could not survive another year of waiting for a door that did not open. Chloe's wedding to Preston Cole took place the following spring, an event that cost, according to the wedding announcement I found later in the Denver Business Journal's society pages, an estimated $200,000, so more than double the trust fund my father had liquidated from my own future to shore up a construction loan. I was not invited. My mother later told me, in one of our increasingly rare and increasingly strained phone calls, that they hadn't wanted to stress me out during my recovery. I did not attend Tyler's wedding 2 years after that either, though by then the reason offered was different. By then, the truth was simpler and colder. Nobody had thought to invite me, and when I asked my mother about it afterward, she seemed genuinely surprised that I would have wanted to come. You two were never that close, she said, as though closeness were something that happened to siblings by accident, rather than something a family builds on purpose, meal by meal, holiday by holiday, hospital visit by hospital visit, or fails to build in exactly the same way. By the time I turned 27, 3 years after the accident, I had stopped expecting phone calls on my birthday. I had stopped checking my mailbox for cards. I had, without any single dramatic decision, simply drifted out of my family's orbit entirely, the way a satellite drifts when the gravity holding it in place quietly, gradually, stops pulling. What I did not yet understand, what I would not understand for another 7 years, was that this drift, this quiet unraveling of a family that had never really held me tightly to begin with, was the single greatest gift my family would ever accidentally give me. Because it meant that when I finally built something extraordinary, I built it without a single one of them watching, without a single one of them shaping it, without a single one of them ever getting the chance to tell me it was impractical. Here's something strange about growing up in the shadow of a family business you're never meant to run. You absorb its language anyway, without meaning to, the way a child absorbs a second language just from being in the room while adults speak it. I had spent years before the accident doing the bookkeeping for Whitfield and Sons, a job my father gave me because it kept me close, not because he believed I had any particular talent for it. But in doing that job, in reconciling invoices and tracking project budgets, and listening to my father complain, night after night at dinner, about the same 3 problems every construction company in America seems to complain about. Subcontractors who didn't communicate. Project timelines that slipped because nobody had real-time visibility into what was happening on site. Budgets that blew past their limits because change orders got tracked on paper and lost in someone's truck. I had absorbed, without realizing it, an intimate, granular understanding of exactly where the construction industry's software was failing it. It was Salvatore, during one of our now monthly phone calls. We had stayed close after Meadow Ridge, meeting for coffee when my schedule allowed, talking on the phone when it didn't. Who first said the sentence that changed the direction of my life. "You keep telling me about all these problems your father's company had," he said. "Every time you talk about it, your voice changes. You get sharper. Have you ever thought about just building the thing that fixes it instead of building websites for dentists?" I laughed it off at first. I was 28 years old, running a small freelance web development business that made me enough money to live modestly and put a little aside every month. But the idea of building actual software, a real product, the kind of thing that required funding and a team and years of development, felt, even after everything I had survived, like exactly the kind of impractical dream my father had trained me to distrust in myself. But the idea didn't leave. It sat in the back of my mind for months, growing quietly, the way ideas do when you keep feeding them small scraps of attention without fully committing to them. I started sketching it on napkins. A project management platform built specifically for mid-sized construction firms, not the bloated enterprise software the big companies used, not the too simple apps meant for solo contractors, but something in between. Something that understood the actual chaos of a 200-person construction company trying to track 40 subcontractors across 6 job sites at once. I called it Foundry Line. I built the first prototype myself, over 8 months, teaching myself full-stack development at a pace that terrified me, working from that same 420-square-foot studio apartment, surviving on ramen and freelance income and a stubbornness that I am fairly certain I inherited, ironically, from the very father who had never once told me I was capable of this. The first version of Foundry Line was ugly. I want to be honest about that too. It crashed constantly. It had exactly one feature that worked reliably: a simple, real-time change order tracking tool that let site supervisors log changes from a phone instead of a clipboard, syncing instantly with the office's budget spreadsheet. But that one feature, it turned out, was the exact wound that every mid-sized construction firm in America was quietly bleeding from, and when I offered it, free, to 12 small construction companies in the Denver area in exchange for feedback, 9 of them were still using it, unprompted, 3 months later. Salvatore invested first, $11,000 of his careful, meticulous stock portfolio, the entire amount he'd built up in the 2 years since Meadow Ridge, handed to me across a diner table with a seriousness that still brings tears to my eyes when I think about it. "I'm not doing this because I think you'll get rich," he told me. "I'm doing it because I've watched you build something out of nothing twice now. First yourself, then this. And I want to be able to say I believed in you before anyone else did." Nobody in my family knew any of this was happening. I had by then changed my legal name, not dramatically, just a return to my mother's maiden name, Hale, folded in as a middle name I began using professionally, Emma Hale Whitfield, collapsing, in every business document and every incorporation filing, into simply Emma Hale. It wasn't an act of rage, it was an act of privacy, a small wall I built around the one part of my life that had never been managed, shaped, or claimed by anyone else, and I built it instinctively, the way you protect a small flame from wind without fully understanding. Yet, how much you'll need that fire to survive the years ahead. Foundry Line got its first real venture funding, $200,000 from a small Denver-based angel investment group, when I was 30 years old, 6 years after the accident. I remember sitting in the conference room where they made the offer, in a blazer I'd bought secondhand and altered myself because I still couldn't afford a tailor, and thinking about my father's kitchen table, about "you're being dramatic," about the $80,000 that had vanished into a construction loan without my consent, and feeling something settle in my chest that was not quite triumph and not quite peace, but was, for the first time in my adult life, unmistakably mine. By the time I was 32, Foundry Line had grown from 12 pilot customers to over 400 construction firms across 11 states, a team of 31 employees, and a Series A funding round that valued the company at $19 million. I had, without a single member of my family knowing my new name, built something larger than the empire my father had spent 40 years assembling. Quietly, invisibly, in the exact blind spot my family's absence had accidentally carved out for me. I did not do this for revenge. I want to be very clear about that, because it is the single most important thing I have learned in the 10 years since that hospital bed, and it is the thing I hope anyone listening to this story takes with them more than anything else. Revenge was never the engine. The engine was survival. And then, slowly, unexpectedly, purpose. The simple, sustaining discovery that I was capable of things nobody in my family had ever bothered to imagine for me. But I would be lying if I said that some small, quiet part of me didn't wonder, on the nights when the work was hardest, what my father's face would look like if he ever found out. I did not have to wonder for very much longer. I did not follow my family's life closely in those years. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy, in telling this story, to paint myself as someone quietly monitoring their downfall from a distance, waiting for my moment. That was never who I was. I built Foundry Line because I loved the work, because Salvatore believed in me, because for the first time in my life I had discovered a version of myself that nobody had shrunk to fit a role. My family simply stopped being a subject I thought about on a daily basis, the way a country you emigrated from as a child slowly stops appearing in your dreams. But Denver is a smaller city than people assume, especially in the tight-knit world of commercial construction and real estate, and pieces of information reached me anyway, the way smoke reaches you from a fire you're not standing near. Through industry news, through mutual acquaintances at business events I attended under the name Emma Hale, through a construction trade publication that occasionally covered Whitfield and Sons because Foundry Line, ironically, had by then become software used by several of my father's competitors. What I learned, in fragments over the years, was this. The Meridian Project, the office tower my father had bid so aggressively to win, the project that had swallowed my inheritance and Tyler's, had gone catastrophically over budget. A structural engineering error, discovered halfway through construction, had required an expensive redesign. The tenant my father had lined up as the building's anchor client backed out during the delay, spooked by the cost overruns and construction news coverage. Whitfield and Sons finished the building 2 years late and $11 million over budget, and the company spent the better part of 5 years trying to recover from a financial wound that never fully closed. My father, I heard, had aged badly under the strain, not just in appearance, though people who saw him at industry events described someone who looked a decade older than his years, but in judgment. He grew more controlling, not less, the way people often do when the ground beneath them starts to shift. He pushed Tyler into operational roles Tyler was not equipped for, promoted him to Chief Operating Officer at 29 years old, with no real construction management experience beyond a business degree and a last name, and watched, over the following years, as Tyler made a series of decisions, underbidding 2 more projects to chase revenue, alienating 2 of the company's longest-standing subcontractor relationships through mismanaged payment schedules that compounded the damage from Meridian rather than repairing it. Chloe's marriage to Preston Cole, I learned much later and with no satisfaction at all, had ended after 4 years, not dramatically but exhaustingly, the slow unraveling of 2 people who had married a business alliance rather than each other. She moved back into my parents' house in her early 30s with a young daughter, my niece, a little girl named Harper whom I have still, to this day, never met. None of this reached me as gossip I sought out. It reached me the way weather reaches you, ambient, unavoidable, background noise to a life I was building with an intensity that left little room for looking backward. I want to be honest that there were nights, in those years, when a piece of news about my family would land and I would feel a flicker of something, not joy exactly, but a kind of bitter recognition. The recognition of watching a prediction you never wanted to be right about come true anyway. I am not proud of every feeling I had in those years. I am only telling you honestly what they were. What I did not know, what nobody in my family knew either, because my grandfather Walter had been, in his final years, quietly and deliberately keeping a secret from every single one of us, was that the $80,000 trust my father had liquidated when I was recovering in Meadow Ridge had never been the entirety of what Walter Whitfield intended to leave me. My grandfather died 2 years before my accident, when I was 22 years old, and the will that was read to the family at the time listed 3 equal trusts for his grandchildren and a controlling transfer of Whitfield and Sons' ownership structure to my father, effective immediately. That was the will everyone knew about. That was the will my father had built the next decade of his life around. What none of us knew was that Walter Whitfield had, 18 months before his death, quietly amended his estate plan a second time through a small, discreet law firm in Boulder that had no connection to the family's usual attorneys, a fact that would only come to light a decade later, buried in a filing cabinet at a firm my grandfather had chosen. I would come to understand, specifically because it had no relationship with my father at all. That amended plan established a secondary trust, separate from the $80,000, holding a 22% ownership stake in Whitfield and Sons that Walter had structured to remain dormant, invisible on the company's public ownership documents, controlled by a trustee, until a triggering condition was met. Either my 34th birthday or a moment of what the document specifically called material financial distress to the company, requiring unanimous shareholder consent for refinancing, whichever came first. I did not know this trust existed. My father did not know it existed. Nobody but my grandfather and the trustee he had appointed, a retired estate attorney named Harold Voss, who had known Walter for 40 years and had been sworn, under the terms of his own retainer, to total confidentiality until the trigger condition activated, knew that a fifth of Whitfield and Sons had been sitting, silently, waiting for a decade, in the name of the granddaughter my grandfather had apparently watched more closely and understood more deeply than anyone else in that family ever had. I would not learn any of this until the week everything changed, but I have come to believe, in the years since, that my grandfather knew exactly what kind of family he was leaving me in. I believe he saw what I could not yet see in myself. And I believe that quiet, careful amendment, made in a law office 2 towns over from the one his own son used, was the single greatest act of faith anyone in my family ever showed me, delivered 10 years before I would ever know it existed, from a man who was no longer alive to see whether it landed. It landed. Just not in the way any of them expected. I was in a board meeting when my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in 9 years. Foundry Line had grown by then into something I still sometimes had to remind myself was real. 190 employees, contracts with construction firms across 23 states, a valuation that had crossed $140 million after our most recent funding round, and a name, Emma Hale, that had started appearing in regional business publications as one of Colorado's fastest rising tech founders, always accompanied by a bio that mentioned a spinal injury and long recovery, but never once mentioned the family I had built the company entirely without. I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of reviewing our expansion budget for the following fiscal year with my CFO, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya. Yes, the same Priya, the nurse who had given me that tablet at Meadow Ridge, whom I had tracked down 4 years into building Foundry Line and offered a job the moment I learned she had gone back to school for accounting after leaving nursing. Because some debts you do not simply thank someone for, you find a way to walk beside them for the rest of your life instead. I glanced at the screen, saw the area code, felt a strange, cold recognition settle in my stomach before I even consciously placed the number, and stepped out of the meeting. Emma. My father's voice. Older than I remembered it, rougher at the edges but unmistakably his, unmistakably carrying that same tone he'd used my entire childhood. Not a request, never quite a request, always something closer to an assumption that I would simply comply. "It's your father." "I know," I said. "How did you get this number?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that told me the answer was going to be one I didn't like. "Your mother found an old business card from a construction conference a few years back. Foundry Line. We didn't Emma, we didn't know that was you. For a long time. Not until recently." I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, the way I had learned to let silences stretch in negotiations, understanding, from years of building a company from nothing, that the person who fills the silence first often reveals the most about what they actually need. "I need to talk to you about something important," my father finally said. "Family business. It's serious, Emma. I wouldn't be calling otherwise." "I imagine not," I said. Another pause. "Whitfield and Sons is in trouble. Real trouble. We took on significant debt after the Meridian project. You probably don't know about all that. You've been gone a long time, and the bank is calling in the note. We need to refinance, restructure the ownership, bring in new capital, and our lawyers tell us there's a complication with an old trust structure your grandfather set up. Something about a dormant ownership stake that needs to be resolved before any of the banks will move forward. There's a signature required, a shareholder consent. And it turns out," his voice tightened, and for the first time in the conversation I heard something underneath the assumption, something that sounded almost like fear. "It turns out that signature is yours." I sat down on the edge of the small couch in my office lobby, my heart moving in a way I hadn't expected. Not with triumph. Not yet. With something closer to disbelief. "What signature?" I said carefully. "What are you talking about?" "Your grandfather left you shares," my father said, and I could hear, even through the phone, how much it cost him to say it. How many years of assuming he alone controlled that company were compressing themselves into this single sentence. 22%. In some kind of trust we didn't even know existed until 3 weeks ago, when the bank's due diligence team found it during the refinancing review. 22%, Emma. Held for you. This whole time. I did not say anything for a long moment. Through the glass wall of my office, I could see Priya watching me from the conference room, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern as she read something in my face that I did not yet have words for. "Emma," my father said, and his voice had changed now, had shifted into a register I had never once heard him use with me in 34 years, something almost pleading. "We need you to sign the consent. Without it, the bank pulls the refinancing, and without the refinancing, the company doesn't survive the quarter. 412 employees. Emma. Their families. Everything your grandfather built. I know things weren't. I know it's been a long time. But this isn't about us. This is bigger than us. Will you come to the office? Can we sit down and talk about this properly?" I looked through the glass at Priya, at the woman who had once smuggled a tablet into a state-subsidized care facility because a broken 24-year-old stranger needed a reason to keep waking up in the morning, and I thought about 11 months at Meadow Ridge, about $80,000 vanishing into a construction loan without my knowledge or consent, about $11 for a cab I never got repaid, about a wedding I wasn't invited to, and a niece I had never met. And I thought, too, about my grandfather, a man I had loved without ever fully understanding, sitting in some quiet law office in Boulder 18 months before his death, setting aside a piece of his life's work for a granddaughter nobody else in the family had bothered to watch closely enough to understand. "Send me the paperwork," I told my father. "All of it. Every document related to this trust, the loan, the refinancing terms, the company's current financials. I'll have my legal team review it." "Your legal team," my father repeated, and I could hear, even in those two words, the specific, particular shock of a man recalibrating in real time everything he thought he understood about his own daughter. "Yes," I said. "My legal team. I run a company, Dad. I have one." I hung up before he could respond, and I sat there for a long moment in the quiet of my office lobby, looking out at the Denver skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, at a city that held both the small studio apartment above a laundromat where I had built the first version of Foundry Line and the office tower, 4 blocks from that same apartment, where my father's failing company was headquartered. 10 years. It had taken exactly 10 years for the door to finally open, but this time I was the one standing on the other side of it, and I intended, for the first time in my entire life, to decide for myself whether I wanted to walk through. The documents arrived 2 days later, a thick courier envelope delivered to Foundry Line's headquarters. 41 pages of trust language, loan covenants, and financial disclosures that would have meant very little to the 24-year-old bookkeeper I once was, but meant a great deal to the founder and CEO I had since become. I did not review them alone. I brought in my general counsel, a careful, meticulous woman named Renata Cho, who had joined Foundry Line during our Series A round, and who had, over the years, become someone I trusted with more than just contracts. I also, on a hunch I could not quite explain even to myself, tracked down the name listed on the trust documents as its trustee. Harold Voss, attorney at law, an address in Boulder I did not recognize. A small firm that appeared to specialize in estate planning for a modest but loyal roster of clients. I called Harold Voss myself, without telling my father, 3 days after receiving the documents. He was 71 years old, his voice slow and deliberate in the way of a man accustomed to choosing his words with care, and when I introduced myself, there was a long pause on the line before he spoke again. "Emma Whitfield," he said, and something in his voice had shifted, softened. "I have been waiting 9 years to have this conversation." "You knew about me," I said. "This whole time." "I have known about you since the day your grandfather sat in my office and told me, and I quote him directly because I wrote it down at the time, that you were the only one of the 3 who ever actually looked at the ledgers instead of just signing them." Harold Voss let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. "Walter came to me 18 months before he passed. He had watched your father groom your brother for years, watched your sister get everything handed to her without asking for it, and watched you, quietly, doing the actual books, understanding the actual business, and getting none of the credit or the trust that should have come with it. He told me, and this was before your accident, Emma, before any of what happened at that hospital, he told me he was worried that if he left the company entirely to your father, the family's real talent would go to waste, buried under a hierarchy that had nothing to do with ability and everything to do with birth order and charm. I sat with that for a long moment, my hand pressed flat against my desk, steadying myself against a truth I had never once allowed myself to imagine. That somewhere in that house, in those years I spent believing I was invisible, one person had actually been watching and had seen exactly what I was. "There's something else," Harold Voss said. "Your grandfather left a letter. Sealed, meant for you specifically, to be delivered upon the trust's activation, whichever trigger came first. Your 34th birthday, or a moment of financial distress requiring your consent. Given what's happening with the company right now, I believe the second condition has been met. I can have it sent to you today, if you'd like." I asked him to send it. It arrived by courier the following morning, a single cream-colored envelope inside a modern shipping box, my grandfather's handwriting on the front. Emma, in the same careful engineer's block lettering I remembered from birthday cards he used to slip me privately. Always $5 more than what he gave Tyler and Chloe. Always with a small wink that told me it was our secret. I did not open it right away. I sat at my desk for nearly 20 minutes, the envelope resting on the surface in front of me, before I finally broke the seal. "Emma, if you're reading this, it means one of two things has happened. Either you've turned 34, which means you made it, whatever making it ended up meaning for you, and I am deeply, deeply glad. Or it means the company is in trouble. Which means your father made mistakes I tried to warn him about more times than either of us would care to count. And now the family needs something from you that they were never willing to give you freely. I want to tell you why I did this. I watched you for years, Emma, more closely than you probably ever realized, because you were the only one of my grandchildren who never once asked me for anything. Tyler asked me for a truck when he turned 16. Chloe asked me to buy out a modeling contract she didn't even want, just because she liked the idea of being asked. You never asked me for a single thing. You just showed up every summer and sat with me in the workshop while I explained load calculations to a granddaughter who understood them faster than either of her siblings ever could have, if they'd bothered to try. I am not a sentimental man, and I want to be honest that this isn't only sentiment. It's judgment. I built this company from a truck and a toolbox, and I have spent my whole life watching people try to inherit things they never earned the understanding for. Your father is a good man, but he was handed this company, and handed men rarely learn to hold things as carefully as earned men do. I have watched him make decisions in the last few years of my life that worried me. Aggressive bids, thin margins, a hunger to prove himself against my own legacy that I fear will someday cost him more than he can afford to lose. So I did something I never told him about. I set aside a piece of this company for the one grandchild who actually understood it, not as an inheritance to be spent, but as a safeguard, a piece of ballast, something that would only matter if the ship ever started to list too far in one direction. I made sure it would stay hidden until you needed it, or until the company needed you, whichever came first, because I did not want you living your life waiting for a piece of paper to save you. I wanted you to build your own life first, on your own terms, and I wanted this to be a floor beneath you, not a ceiling above you. I don't know what's happened in the years since I wrote this. I don't know if your father did right by you or wrong by you, though if I'm honest with myself, I have my fears. If it's the latter, if you're reading this because they hurt you and are only now coming back because they need something, I want you to know that you owe this family nothing you do not choose, freely, to give. The shares are yours regardless. What you do with them, and with the people asking for your help, is entirely, finally, your decision to make. You were never the middle child to me, Emma. You were always the one holding the whole thing up. I love you. I always did. I only wish I'd said it more, while I still had the chance. Grandpa Walter. I read that letter 4 times before I could set it down, and when I finally did, I understood, with a clarity that felt less like anger and more like arrival, exactly what I was going to do. I did not go to my father's office right away. I told him, through a brief professional email sent from my assistant's account rather than my own, a small, deliberate act of distance I am not ashamed of, that I would need 2 weeks to review the company's full financial position before making any decision about the consent. Those 2 weeks were, in some ways, the most illuminating of the entire 10 years. Renata and I brought in an outside forensic accountant, a sharp, unflappable woman named Deborah and Kemelu, who had helped us with due diligence during our own funding rounds, and we spent those 2 weeks going through Whitfield and Sons books the way I had once, as a 22-year-old bookkeeper, gone through invoices at my father's kitchen table. Except this time, I understood every single number in front of me, and this time, nobody was going to explain them away with, "You're being dramatic." What we found was worse than my father had let on, and better, in a strange way, than I expected, because it confirmed something I had begun to suspect the moment I heard my brother's name attached to the role of Chief Operating Officer. The Meridian project had cost the company far more than the $11 million over budget I had heard about years earlier through industry gossip. The true figure, once we accounted for the financing costs of the loans taken to cover the overruns, was closer to $19 million, a wound that had never properly healed and had instead been patched over, repeatedly, with new debt taken against increasingly thin collateral. Tyler's tenure as COO, over the 5 years since, had compounded the damage significantly. 2 underbid projects that had lost the company nearly $4 million combined, an exodus of experienced project managers who had left for competitors after growing tired of Tyler's erratic decision-making, and a subcontractor relationship crisis so severe that Whitfield and Sons had, in the past 18 months, been placed on a watch list by 2 of the region's largest steel and concrete suppliers, who now required payment up front before delivering materials. The company was not simply in trouble. It was, by any honest accounting, roughly 4 months from insolvency, kept alive only by a revolving credit line that the bank was now, as my father had said, threatening to pull entirely unless the ownership structure was resolved, and a personal guarantee, my father's house, the family home I had grown up in, was put up as additional collateral for the refinancing. I sat with Deborah's final report for a long time, feeling something I had not expected to feel, not vindication, though there was a thread of that woven through everything, but something closer to grief. Grief for the company my grandfather had actually built, the one with his name on it, the one now buried under a decade of decisions made by people who had inherited his legacy without ever earning the judgment required to steward it. It was during this same 2-week period that my father called again, and I learned something about him that I had, on some level, always suspected but had never seen confirmed so plainly. He did not call to check on my progress, or to ask how I was doing, or to apologize. He called to tell me that he had scheduled a family dinner for that Sunday, framing it, in a voice that had regained some of its old assumption of authority now that 2 weeks had passed without a refusal, as an opportunity to sit down as a family and work this out together, the way we should have all along. "I also wanted to let you know," he added, almost as an afterthought in a tone clearly meant to sound casual, "that our attorneys drafted a simplified consent form, in case you'd rather just sign something quick instead of dealing with all that complicated trust paperwork. I can have it sent over. Might save everyone a headache." I asked Renata to review the simplified consent form the moment it arrived that afternoon, and what she found confirmed, more thoroughly than any forensic report could have, exactly what kind of family meeting I was walking into. The document was not simplified. It was, in fact, deliberately structured to accomplish two things at once, buried in dense legal language clearly designed to discourage careful reading. First, it would grant the consent required to release the trust shares for use as loan collateral, and second, in a clause tucked into page 6, under a heading labeled innocuously as Ancillary Governance Provisions. It would simultaneously transfer my voting rights on those shares to my father as proxy, permanently, regardless of whether the refinancing succeeded or failed, effectively giving him full control of a 22% stake that my grandfather had explicitly, deliberately, left for me to hold and decide upon myself. I read that clause 3 times. Then I read my grandfather's letter again. The line I had already read a dozen times, but that landed differently now. Freshly. You owe this family nothing you do not choose, freely, to give. My father had known, before I ever walked into that Sunday dinner, that his own daughter's careful, hard-won judgment was something to be maneuvered around rather than respected. Even now, even with his company collapsing, even with his own daughter holding the exact signature that could save it, his first instinct had not been honesty. It had been a trick, quietly slipped into page 6, betting that a daughter he had never once respected enough to watch closely would not think to read the fine print. He was wrong. And on that Sunday, I intended to make sure he understood, once and for all, exactly how wrong he had been. About the document. And about me. I almost didn't go. I want to admit that honestly, because I think it matters. There was a version of that Sunday where I simply sent Renata in my place with a signed refusal letter and let the silence between my family and me stretch out permanently, uninterrupted, the way it had been comfortably stretching for 9 years already. But Salvatore, when I called him the night before, sitting on the floor of my apartment with my grandfather's letter still on the coffee table in front of me, told me something that changed my mind. You don't have to go for them, he said. Go for you. Go so that 10 years from now, when you tell this story, and Misha, you will tell this story, someday, to someone, you can say you looked them in the eye and told them the truth yourself, instead of hiding behind a lawyer because you were too afraid of what you'd feel in that room. You've spent your whole life letting other people write your story for you. Write this chapter yourself. I drove to my parents' house Sunday afternoon in a car that cost more than the entire Meridian Construction Loan's initial down payment, and I sat in the driveway for nearly 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of a strange, disorienting grief at how small the house looked now, how ordinary, after 10 years of imagining it as something larger, something that had once had the power to break me simply by turning its back. My mother answered the door. She had aged more than I expected, her hair fully gray now, streaked with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single crisis, but from years of quietly accumulating them. And when she saw me, standing on the porch in a blazer that fit exactly right, because I could finally afford a tailor, something in her face crumpled in a way I had not prepared myself for. Emma, she said, and her voice broke on the single syllable of my name. You look so grown up. I am grown up, Mom, I said gently, because even after everything, some old part of me still reached instinctively for gentleness with her. I've been grown up for a while now. Inside, the dining room looked almost exactly as I remembered it. The same table, the same chairs, though the good china had been replaced at some point with a plainer set, a small, silent testament to the financial strain the family had been living under longer than I'd realized. My father stood when I entered, and for a moment neither of us said anything, two people measuring the decade of distance between us in a single held look. Tyler was there, heavier than I remembered, his easy confidence replaced by something more brittle, more defensive, the posture of a man who had spent 5 years failing upward and knew it. Chloe was there too, and beside her, holding tightly to her hand, a little girl of about 7 with the same dark curls my mother had at that age. My niece, Harper, whom I was meeting for the first time in her life, a fact that settled into my chest with a weight I had not anticipated. Chloe caught me looking at Harper and something flickered across her face. Not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. "Harper, this is your Aunt Emma," she said quietly, and Harper looked up at me with wide, curious eyes and said simply, "I didn't know I had an aunt." And I had to look away for a moment, because that single unguarded sentence from a 7-year-old contained more honesty than anything my parents had managed to offer me in 10 years combined. Dinner started stiffly, my mother filling the silence with small talk about nothing, the weather, a neighbor's renovation, anything to avoid the actual reason we were all sitting at that table. Until my father, halfway through the meal, finally set down his fork and said what everyone had been circling. "I assume you've reviewed the paperwork?" he said. "I have," I said. "All of it, including the version with the proxy clause buried on page 6. The table went silent. My father's jaw tightened. That was just a standard governance provision. Our attorneys included it to simplify the process. "It transferred my voting rights to you permanently," I said, keeping my voice level. The same voice I used in board meetings when an investor tried to slip an unfavorable term into a clean deal. "Regardless of the refinancing outcome, I read it 3 times, Dad. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't standard. It was designed to take the one thing Grandpa left specifically for me to control myself, and put it back in your hands without me fully understanding what I was signing. Which is, I'd point out, almost exactly what happened with my trust 10 years ago, while I was recovering in a hospital bed from an accident none of you visited me for." "Emma?" my mother said, her voice pleading. "Please, can we not do this right now? Can we just—" "When would be a better time, Mom?" I asked, and I heard my own voice crack slightly, the first crack in 10 years of careful composure. "I've been waiting 10 years for a better time. You had 11 months at Meadow Ridge to find one. You had my sister's wedding. You had Tyler's wedding. You had a decade of birthdays. There was never a better time, because a better time would have required someone in this family to decide that I mattered enough to interrupt something more convenient." Tyler spoke up then, defensive, the old easy confidence trying and failing to reassert itself. "That's not fair, Emma. We were all going through a hard time. The Meridian Project was eating everyone alive. Dad was under enormous pressure. You make it sound like we just— what? Decided we didn't care about you." "You didn't decide it," I said, turning to look at him directly for the first time since I'd walked in. "That's exactly the problem, Tyler. Nobody decided anything. Nobody sat down and made a choice to hurt me. It just happened. Gradually. Because I was the easiest person in this family to stop showing up for. Chloe had a wedding. You had a company to inherit. Mom had Dad to manage. And I had a spinal injury and 11 months in a facility so understaffed that my roommate screamed for her dead husband every night, and not one of you found 30 minutes, once, to make the drive." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Harper, sensing the tension the way children always do, tugged on Chloe's sleeve and asked, in a small voice, if she could be excused. And Chloe, her face pale, nodded and watched her daughter disappear into the living room before turning back to me. "I didn't know," Chloe said quietly. "I mean, I knew you were hurt, but I didn't know it was that bad, that long. I was 26 and getting married, and I let myself not look too closely, because it was easier." It was the first honest thing anyone at that table had said to me in 10 years, and it did not fix anything, but it cracked something open in the room that had not been open before. My father, though, was not ready to crack. "Emma, I understand you're angry, and you have every right to be. But we don't have time for a decade of grievances tonight. The bank needs an answer by Friday. 412 employees are counting on this company surviving. Are you going to sign the consent? Or are you going to let your grandfather's company collapse over something that happened 10 years ago? I looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had liquidated my inheritance without asking, who had not visited me once in 11 months, who had, 3 weeks earlier, tried to slip a proxy clause past me on page 6 spy, and I felt, for the first time since walking into that house, something settle into place inside me that was not anger and was not grief, but was, finally, absolute clarity. I'm not signing the consent form your attorneys drafted, I said. But I do have an offer. And I'd suggest you listen to the whole thing before you say anything, because it's the only one you're going to get. Here is what I know, I said. And the table went very still, the particular stillness of people who have just realized the person speaking is no longer asking for permission. I know that Whitfield and Sons is roughly 4 months from insolvency. I know the Meridian project cost this company $19 million, not the 11 you told me about on the phone. I know Tyler's underbid projects lost another $4 million, and I know 2 of your major suppliers have you on a cash-only watch list because they don't trust your payment history anymore. I know all of this not because I've been spying on this family, but because I hired a forensic accountant and spent 2 weeks doing what none of you apparently thought to do for yourselves, actually reading the numbers honestly. My father's face had gone pale, the particular pale of a man realizing the daughter across the table understands his company's failures more precisely than his own son does. I also know, I continued, that I own 22% of this company, in a trust Grandpa Walter set up specifically because he didn't trust the rest of you to run it without me. I've read his letter. I know exactly why he did it. And I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because it's true, and because I've spent enough of my life having the truth managed around me by people who thought I couldn't handle it. So what do you want? Tyler said, his voice tight. You want an apology? Fine. I'm sorry. We're all sorry. Is that what this is about? No, I said. I want the company to survive, because 412 families don't deserve to lose their livelihoods over decisions they had no part in making. That much I actually do care about, for Grandpa's sake, if nothing else. But I am done being asked to hand over trust and money and forgiveness for free, on your timeline, the way I've handed everything over to this family my entire life. So here's my offer, and it's not a negotiation. I laid it out for them exactly as Renata and I had spent the previous 3 days structuring it. Foundry Line would extend Whitfield and Sons a structured line of credit sufficient to satisfy the bank and stabilize operations. Not a gift, a loan, at market terms, secured properly, the way any responsible lender would structure it. In exchange, I would exercise my 22% trust shares and purchase an additional 29% of the company directly from my father, at a fair, independently appraised valuation reflecting the company's current distressed position. Not a punitive lowball, not a favor, simply the truth of what a company 4 months from insolvency was actually worth. This would give me a controlling 51% ownership stake in Whitfield and Sons. Tyler would step down from his role as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately, and the company would bring in an experienced outside construction executive to run day-to-day operations, someone with the judgment my grandfather had spent his whole life earning, and that neither Tyler nor, I said gently but without flinching, my father had fully demonstrated in the years since Walter's death. Tyler could remain with the company in a project management role suited to his actual experience, if he wanted it, starting at a level commensurate with his skills rather than his last name, with the opportunity to rebuild trust the way every other employee in that company had always had to. My father would remain chairman of the board in name, a title I offered not as a courtesy, but because I understood, even then, that stripping every single thing from a man in one evening rarely produces the reckoning people imagine it will. It produces only defensiveness, and I was not interested in defensiveness. I was interested in an actual company surviving, run by actual competence, with dignity preserved wherever dignity had. That's it, I said when I finished. You have until Friday, same as the bank's deadline. If you accept, my legal team will have the full documentation to you by Wednesday. If you don't, I withdraw my consent entirely. The trust remains dormant. And you find another way to survive the bank's deadline without my shares. Either way, I'm no longer available to be managed, guilt-tripped, or maneuvered into a decision I haven't reviewed carefully myself. That version of me stayed behind in a hospital bed in Meadow Ridge, and she is not coming back. The table was silent for a long moment. My father's hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly against the tablecloth, though whether from anger or something closer to shame, I genuinely could not tell. You'd take my company, he said finally quietly. After everything. You'd just take it. I'm not taking anything that wasn't already offered to me, freely, by a man who understood exactly what he was doing when he wrote a letter I only got to read 3 weeks ago, I said. Grandpa built ballast into this family on purpose, Dad, because he saw something you never let yourself see. That competence in this family never had anything to do with birth order, and everything to do with who actually paid attention. You didn't lose this company to me tonight. You lost it, slowly, over 10 years, to decisions you made without me in the room, because you decided a long time ago that the room didn't need me in it. I stood up from the table then, my chair scraping quietly against the floor, and I looked at my mother, whose face was wet with tears she wasn't bothering to hide anymore, and at Chloe, whose expression had shifted into something that looked, for the first time in 10 years, like actual reckoning rather than performance. I'll wait to hear from your attorneys by Friday, I said. You know how to reach me now. I did not slam the door on my way out. I want that detail remembered clearly, because it matters to me. I did not need the drama of a slammed door to know that something enormous had just shifted, permanently, in the architecture of a family that had spent 34 years teaching me exactly how small a person could be made to feel, before finally, 10 years too late, discovering exactly how large I had become without them. I did not sleep well that week. I want to admit that too, because I think there's a version of this story people expect. The triumphant founder, striding away from her family's dinner table with total, unshaken confidence, feeling nothing but the clean satisfaction of a debt finally collected. That is not what those 4 days felt like. What those 4 days actually felt like was grief, arriving late and out of order, the way grief sometimes does when you've spent a decade too busy surviving to properly feel it. I grieved the father who had taught me to ride a bike in a church parking lot, because I understood, sitting in my apartment that week, that the version of him capable of that tenderness had been slowly replaced, over years of pressure and inherited expectation, by a man who saw his own daughter's pain as a line item to be minimized. I grieved the sister I might have had, if either of us had been raised in a family that taught its children to look out for each other instead of compete for scraps of attention. I grieved, most of all, the 11 months in that hospital bed, because reviewing my father's finances that week had made painfully, mathematically clear exactly how easily they could have afforded to visit, to call, to simply show up. The abandonment had never been about money. It had been about priority, and I had simply never been one. Renata called me Thursday afternoon with an update. Harold Voss, the trustee, had been in contact with my father's attorneys all week, walking them through the trust documents line by line, and word had apparently reached my father, through his own legal team, that contesting the trust's validity, an option his lawyers had briefly explored, would be not only unsuccessful, given how airtight Walter Whitfield had built the structure, but would also delay any resolution well past the bank's deadline, guaranteeing the exact collapse my father was trying to avoid. The offer was accepted Friday morning, 11 minutes before the deadline I had set. My father signed every document Renata's team had prepared, without a single change, without a single attempt at another proxy clause buried on another quiet page. I don't know, to this day, whether that was humility or simply exhaustion, whether 10 years of watching a company he loved slowly crumble under decisions he'd made had finally taught him something my whole childhood of quiet compliance never had. I choose, most days, to believe it was at least partially the former, because I have found, in the years since, that believing the best of people you've released from your daily life costs you nothing and sometimes gives you something valuable in return. Tyler took the demotion harder than I expected, though not in the end in a way that surprised me. He was angry for exactly one conversation, a tense, clipped phone call in which he accused me of enjoying his humiliation, of using Grandpa's trust as an excuse to finally get even. And then, 3 weeks later, he called again. This time in a voice I had genuinely never heard him use before, quiet and uncertain, and asked whether the project management position was still open. He has been in that role for the better part of a year now, I'm told by the outside executive I brought in to run operations, a sharp, patient woman named Grace Okafor who has, in 12 months, done more to stabilize Whitfield and Sons than the family had managed in the decade prior. That Tyler has, against every expectation anyone had of him, turned out to be a genuinely competent project manager once the pressure of being groomed for a job he was never suited to was finally lifted off his shoulders. I don't know if I forgive Tyler exactly. Forgiveness is a word I've learned to be careful with, because I think people often use it to mean something closer to forgetting, and I have not forgotten a single day of those 11 months. But I have made room in the years since for the possibility that a person shaped by the same broken hierarchy that shaped me might, given a genuinely fair chance for the first time in his life, become someone different than the brother who texted through my one hospital visit from him. My father is a different story, and I want to be honest that the different story is a slower one, still unfinished, possibly permanently unfinished. He remains chairman in name. He shows up to board meetings I run, sits quietly, offers opinions I sometimes take and sometimes don't, and has never once, in the year since that Sunday dinner, offered me a direct, unambiguous apology for the 11 months at Meadow Ridge. He has said, on 2 separate occasions, some version of, "I know things were hard back then," which is not the same thing, and I have learned not to wait for the version that is. I have found a strange peace in that particular acceptance, not resignation, but the simple adult recognition that some people give you the truest apology they are capable of giving, and it is not always the one you deserve, and your healing cannot be allowed to depend on them ever closing that gap. The relationship that changed the most, in the year that followed that Sunday dinner, was the one I expected least. My relationship with Chloe, and through her, with the niece I had not known existed until she was 7 years old. Chloe called me 2 weeks after the Friday deadline, and I almost didn't answer, assuming it would be another negotiation, another attempt to smooth something over on the family's behalf. It wasn't. She asked if she could take me to lunch, just the 2 of us, no agenda, and something in her voice, a rawness I hadn't heard from my sister since we were small children, before the world had taught her that beauty and ease were currency worth protecting, made me say yes. We sat in a quiet restaurant near my office for 2 hours, and Chloe told me things I had never known, that her marriage to Preston had been, almost from the beginning, a slow-motion loneliness dressed up in a beautiful house, that she had spent years performing a happiness she didn't feel, because our parents had built the wedding into such an enormous symbol of the family's success that she felt she owed them the performance of it working. She told me that in the years since her divorce, moving back into our parents' house with Harper, she had spent a great deal of time thinking about the sisters she'd let disappear without a fight, and that some nights, watching Harper sleep, she thought about what kind of mother she wanted to be, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that it was not the kind of mother our own parents had been to me. "I want Harper to know you," she said, her eyes wet. "Not because of the company, Emma. I don't care about the company. I want her to have an aunt who shows her that women don't have to disappear to keep a family peaceful. I want her to know somebody built like you. I did not fix 10 years of absence in one lunch, and I want to be honest that our relationship, even now, is a careful, still-forming thing, built slowly, the way trust has to be built, with someone who once let you disappear without noticing. But I have, in the years since, become a real presence in Harper's life. Sunday afternoons at the Science Museum, a standing invitation to my office on days when Chloe has meetings and no childcare. A small, growing collection of inside jokes that Harper now guards fiercely, the way children guard the things that make them feel specially loved. Harper asked me once, sitting in my office, swinging her feet from the chair across my desk while she worked on a puzzle I kept in my drawer, specifically for her visits, why I hadn't come to her birthday parties when she was little. I did not lie to her. I have decided, in the years since Meadow Ridge, that the single most important thing I can give the people I love is honesty delivered with care, rather than comfort delivered with dishonesty, because I know now, more intimately than most people ever have to learn, exactly what it costs a person to be protected from a truth they deserve to have. "I got very hurt in an accident before you were born," I told her, choosing words a 7-year-old could hold without being frightened by them. "And for a long time, our family didn't know how to take care of each other very well while I was healing. It wasn't your fault, and it wasn't really your mom's fault either. She was young and scared, and didn't understand yet how much it mattered. But I missed a lot of years I wish I hadn't missed. I'm here now because I decided I didn't want to miss any more of them." Harper considered this with the particular seriousness of a child working through an idea too large for her years, and then she said, simply, "I'm glad you decided that," and went back to her puzzle, and I had to look out the window for a moment, at the Denver skyline stretching out below my office, to keep from crying in front of a 7-year-old who had just, without any idea of what she was doing, said something that healed a piece of me I hadn't fully realized was still open. 1 year after that Friday deadline, Whitfield & Sons posted its first profitable quarter in nearly 6 years. It was not a large profit. Construction margins are thin even in the best of circumstances, and the company was still climbing out of a decade of debt. But it was real, audited, and stable, and Grace Okafor, the operations executive I'd brought in, tells me she believes the company will be fully clear of its Meridian-era debt within another 18 months. 412 employees kept their jobs. I want to say that plainly, without embellishment, because it is the single fact in this entire story that I am proudest of. Prouder even than Foundry Line's own growth. Prouder than the 51% ownership stake. Prouder than any of the vindication I might once have imagined feeling. 412 families who had nothing to do with my father's pride, or my brother's inexperience, or a decade of a family failing to show up for its own daughter kept their paychecks, their health insurance, their mortgages, because a woman they will likely never meet decided that competence and consequence mattered more than comfortable silence. I renamed the company's parent holding structure, quietly, within the first 6 months. Not Whitfield and Sons any longer in its legal filings, though the crews on job sites still wear the old logo, still call it by the name that's stitched into 40 years of work boots and hard hats. The new holding entity is called Walter Grove Holdings, named for my grandfather, and I established, as one of my first acts as controlling owner, a scholarship fund within the company, the Walter Whitfield Engineering Fellowship, that pays full tuition for the children of Whitfield and Sons employees pursuing degrees in engineering, construction management, or architecture, regardless of GPA requirements or family income, because I remembered vividly being told that my own ambitions were impractical, and I decided that no employee's child would ever hear that sentence from the company their parent had helped build. My mother and I have found something quieter than reconciliation, but more durable, I think, than the estrangement that preceded it. She calls now, most weeks, and the calls are shorter than they were when I was a child, but longer, somehow, than anything genuine we managed in the 15 years before the accident. Careful, honest conversations about small things, Harper's school play, a book she's reading, an apology, once, delivered awkwardly over the phone on a Tuesday afternoon for no particular occasion, simply because she said she'd been thinking about Meadow Ridge and needed to say it out loud before she lost her nerve. I should have come, she said. Every single day I should have come. I told myself I was protecting the family, and I understand now that I was just protecting myself from having to watch you suffer and admit I didn't know how to fix it. I did not tell her it was okay, because it was not okay, and I have learned, in the years since that hospital bed, that healing does not require you to lie about the size of the wound. I told her I heard her, and that I was glad she'd said it, and that we could keep building something new from here, slowly, one honest conversation at a time. Salvatore Alvarez is 88 years old now, still sharp, still meticulous, still tracking his portfolio from an apartment I quietly arranged for him near my own building 6 years ago, close enough that I see him most Sundays. He sits on Foundry Line's advisory board, an honorary position that pays him a consulting fee he insists is far too generous and that I insist is far too small, given that his $11,000, handed across a diner table by a man the world had also quietly filed under no longer relevant, became the seed of everything that followed. You know what the real revenge was, he said to me once, on one of those Sunday visits, watching Harper build something elaborate out of blocks on my living room floor, while my mother sat nearby, laughing at something Harper had said. It wasn't the company. It wasn't the money. It was this. He gestured at the room, at a niece who adored me, a mother slowly relearning how to show up, a life built entirely on my own terms, surrounded by people who had chosen me rather than simply been assigned to me by blood. This is the only revenge worth having, Mija. Everything else is just paperwork. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone has said to me in the last 10 years, because I believe, with my whole heart, that he was right. There is a piece of this story I have not yet told, because it took me the longest to untangle, and because of everything my family did, it is the piece that still catches me off guard, even now, when I let myself think about it too directly. The delivery company whose driver ran the red light on Colfax Avenue the night of my accident was insured, as most commercial fleets are, and my father, in the months following the crash, hired a personal injury attorney to pursue a settlement on my behalf, a reasonable, even responsible thing for a parent to do for an injured adult child who was, in those early weeks, in no condition to manage complicated legal proceedings from a hospital bed. I signed the retainer agreement myself, in the third week after the accident, still foggy from pain medication, trusting, the way I had been trained my entire life to trust, that my father was handling this the way he handled everything. Imperfectly, perhaps, but ultimately in the family's interest, which I still, at 24, believed included me. The settlement, when it finally came through 18 months later, well after I had already been discharged from Meadow Ridge and moved into my apartment above the laundromat, totaled $430,000, negotiated down from an initial claim closer to $600,000, because, as I would only learn a decade later through Deborah and Kemalu's forensic review, my father's attorney, a family friend from the same country club circle as my father, not a specialist in catastrophic injury litigation, had settled faster and lower than a specialist likely would have, in exchange for a fee structure that benefited the family's immediate cash needs more than my long-term care requirements. I never saw that money. Not directly. I received during those months a series of checks totaling around $40,000, framed to me by my mother as your portion after the legal fees and the medical liens, a figure I had no way to verify at the time because I did not yet know how to read a settlement statement, and because nobody in my family offered to show me the full document, only the final number they had decided to share. The remaining $390,000, it turned out, had gone, like my grandfather's trust before it, into Whitfield and Sons, structured as an internal loan from the Whitfield family trust account, to cover a second wave of Meridian project costs that had emerged just as the truck settlement arrived, a coincidence in timing that I no longer believe was entirely a coincidence at all. I found the wire transfer records during the 2 weeks of due diligence before that Sunday dinner, buried in an old bank statement Deborah had pulled as part of her broader review of the company's capital history, and I remember sitting at my desk staring at the date. 18 months after my accident, 3 months after I had moved into my apartment believing I had received the entirety of what I was owed, and feeling something I had not expected to feel again after everything else I had already learned that month. Genuine, fresh shock. The particular shock of discovering that a wound you believed had already been fully catalogued had one more layer underneath it. I did not raise this at the Sunday dinner. I want to explain why, because I have thought about that choice many times since, and I believe it was the right one, even though there is a version of me who wonders whether I should have said it out loud in front of everyone, watched my father's face as the full scope of what he'd taken finally landed on the people who loved him. I chose, instead, to fold it quietly into the terms of my offer. The 29% purchase price I structured was calculated, in part, using an internal accounting that credited me, silently, for the settlement money that had never been mine to lend in the first place, effectively recovering it through the equity purchase rather than demanding it back as a separate, humiliating confrontation. Renata knew. Deborah knew. My father's own attorneys, reviewing the valuation model, almost certainly understood exactly what had been accounted for, even if nobody ever said the words out loud in that dining room. I did this not because I was afraid to confront my father with it directly. I think by that point in the story, I had proven to myself and to everyone in that room that I was no longer afraid of very much where he was concerned. I did it because I had learned, over 10 years of building something entirely my own, that the most powerful response to being quietly wronged is not always a loud reckoning. Sometimes it is simply making sure the math finally, silently, comes out even, and walking away with what was always yours, without needing anyone else to admit, out loud, exactly how they took it. I have never told my father I found those records. I suspect someday I will. But that is a conversation for a version of our relationship that does not exist yet, one I am in no hurry to force into being before it is ready, if it is ever ready at all. I want to go back, for a moment, to Meadow Ridge, because I have told you about the beige walls and the bad food and Salvatore's spreadsheets. But I have not yet told you about the night I stood up on my own for the first time, and I think that night belongs in this story more than almost any other, because it is the night I stopped being a patient and started, quietly, becoming the person who would eventually sit across a dinner table from her father and refuse to be managed. It was month 9. I had progressed by then from the wheelchair to a walker, from the walker to a cane on good days, but standing without support, actually rising from a seated position and holding my own weight, unassisted, for more than a few trembling seconds, remained, for reasons the doctors explained in terms involving nerve regeneration and muscle memory that I only half understood, the single hardest physical milestone of my entire recovery. I had been trying for 3 weeks. Every physical therapy session ended the same way, my legs shaking, my arms braced against parallel bars, my body simply refusing to trust itself enough to let go, even for a second, even with a therapist standing close enough to catch me. I had started to believe, in the quiet, exhausted logic of month 9, that this particular milestone might simply be one I would never reach, that I would spend the rest of my life needing something to hold on to. It was nearly 11 at night, well past the facility's official hours, when I woke to the sound of Dolores crying softly in the next bed. Not her usual screaming grief, but something quieter, and I found myself, without quite deciding to, swinging my legs over the side of my own bed and reaching for the walker parked beside it, wanting simply to reach over and hold her hand the way nobody had ever come to hold mine. Her bed was 8 feet away, too far for the walker to comfortably navigate around the narrow gap between our beds and the nightstand between us. I stood there for a long moment, gripping the walker, listening to Dolores cry for a husband who had been dead for 6 years and who she still, some nights, forgot was gone. And I thought about all the nights nobody had come when I needed someone, and something in me simply decided that I was not going to let this be one more night where a person nearby needed something and nobody arrived. I let go of the walker. I do not fully remember the mechanics of what happened next, whether I consciously decided to trust my legs or whether some older, more animal part of my body simply took over. The same instinct that lets a person lift a car off a trapped child. I only remember standing there, in the dark, unsupported, my legs trembling violently but holding, actually holding, for the 4 full steps it took to cross the gap between our beds. And I remember reaching Dolores's bedside and taking her hand, and her turning to look at me with an expression of such simple, startled gratitude that I had to press my own free hand against my mouth to keep from making a sound that would have brought the night nurse running. "You came," Dolores said quietly, and I don't know, even now, whether she meant it about that particular moment or about something larger. Some grief-fogged confusion about her husband, about all the people who hadn't come for either of us across all the years that had led us both to that room. I sat with her for 20 minutes, holding her hand while she cried herself back to sleep, and then I stood again, unassisted, and walked myself back to my own bed, 4 more trembling steps, and lay awake until morning, replaying the fact of it, the simple, enormous fact that I had done it. Not in a therapy gym, not with a therapist's hands hovering nearby ready to catch me, but alone, in the dark, for someone else, because some part of me had finally understood that strength, real strength, is rarely summoned for yourself first. It is summoned when someone else needs you to have it. I told my physical therapist about it the next morning, half expecting her not to believe me, and she cried, actually cried, right there in the therapy gym, and told me it was the fastest unassisted standing recovery she had documented in 6 years at that facility. I did not tell her about Dolores. Some things, I decided even then, belonged only to the person who lived them, not to a chart, not to a case file, not to anyone who would reduce it to a clinical milestone instead of understanding it as what it actually was. The night I discovered that my body, broken as it was, had never actually stopped belonging to me. I have thought about that night more times than I can count, in the years since, especially in the months building Foundry Line when investors doubted me, when the first version of the software crashed for the 40th time, when my father's voice on the phone tried, once again, to convince me I was being unreasonable. I would think about Dolores's hand in mine, and the 4 trembling steps it took to reach her, and I would remember that I had already done the hardest thing this world would ever ask of me, alone, in the dark, at 25 years old, with absolutely nobody watching. Everything after that was, in its own way, simply walking towards something else that needed me to arrive. Building Foundry Line was not a straight line from a hospital tablet to a $140 million valuation, and I think it does this story a disservice to skip past the year I nearly lost the entire company, because that year taught me almost as much about myself as Meadow Ridge did, and because I think anyone listening to this who is building something of their own deserves to hear that the losses are part of the architecture, not a detour from it. It happened when Foundry Line was 3 years old, shortly after our first venture funding round. We had grown too fast, taken on too many enterprise clients before our infrastructure could reliably support them, and during a critical software update meant to add multi-site budget tracking for our largest customer, a construction firm in Phoenix managing 11 simultaneous job sites. A coding error I approved personally corrupted 3 weeks of that client's change order data. Not lost entirely, but scrambled badly enough that reconstructing it accurately took our engineering team 11 straight days, during which the client's own project managers were, quite reasonably, furious, threatening not only to cancel their contract, but to go public in industry forums about the failure, which would have been, for a young company still building its reputation, close to a death sentence. I remember sitting in my office at 2 in the morning during that 11-day stretch, watching my engineering team work in exhausted, silent shifts, and feeling a fear that surprised me with its specific shape. Not the fear of losing money, though we stood to lose a great deal, but the fear of proving my father right, of confirming, to an audience of exactly nobody but myself, that the whole enterprise had been exactly the kind of impractical, overreaching dream he had always warned me against, that a bookkeeper's daughter had no business building software for an industry she'd only ever observed from the margins. I called Salvatore that night, the way I called him during every crisis, large or small, in those years, and he listened to me catalog every possible way the company could collapse before he finally said, in the calm, unhurried voice I had come to depend on more than I depended on almost anyone else's, "Emma, tell me honestly, is the mistake fixable?" "Yes," I said. "It's going to take everything we have for the next 2 weeks, but yes." "Then it's not a catastrophe," he said. "It's a Tuesday. Catastrophes are the things you can't fix no matter how hard you work at them. You've survived actual catastrophes, Mija. This is just a very expensive, very stressful Tuesday. And you are going to handle it exactly the way you handled Meadow Ridge. One step, then the next one, whether or not it feels like enough at the time." We fixed the data. It took 11 days and cost us nearly the entirety of our runway from that funding round, forcing us into a difficult, humbling bridge financing conversation with our investors that I still remember with a flush of old embarrassment. But we fixed it, and more importantly, I insisted, over the objections of two board members who thought it was an unnecessary risk to our reputation, on personally flying to Phoenix to sit across from that client's leadership team and walk them through exactly what had gone wrong, what we had changed to ensure it never happened again, and a credit against their contract that cost the company more than the board was comfortable with, but that I believed, and still believe, was the only honest response to a mistake we had genuinely made. That client stayed with us. More than that, their operations director, a gruff, skeptical man named Frank Delgado, who had spent 30 years in construction and did not extend trust easily, became one of Foundry Line's most vocal references in the years that followed, telling anyone who would listen that he'd never worked with a software company that owned its mistakes as completely as we had, and that the trust he'd built with us afterward ran deeper than it would have if the failure had never happened at all. I think about that lesson often now, sitting across a table from my own father, watching him try, imperfectly and incompletely, to own a decade of mistakes he is still not fully capable of naming out loud. I do not think he has yet found his version of that flight to Phoenix. The moment where you stop protecting your pride and simply sit across from the person you've hurt and tell them, plainly, what happened and what you're doing to make sure it never happens again. I hope, someday, he finds it. I have learned not to build my healing around waiting for him to. There is a part of this story I have hesitated to tell, not because it is more painful than the rest, but because it is more tender, and tenderness is harder to speak about honestly than anger ever was. For most of my 20s, and well into my early 30s, I did not date. I want to be precise about why, because I think the reason matters to anyone listening who recognizes something of themselves in this story. It was not that I lacked opportunity, or that the physical realities of my recovery made me feel unworthy of romantic attention, though there were certainly nights early on when that particular insecurity visited me. It was, instead, something quieter and more insidious, a deeply worn belief, inherited from 34 years of watching my family's attention flow toward Tyler's achievements and Chloe's beauty, while mine required constant proving. That love was a thing you earned through usefulness, through never being a burden, through making yourself small enough and convenient enough that nobody would ever have a reason to leave. I built Foundry Line, in part, as a monument to that belief, though I did not understand it that way at the time. Every late night, every crisis handled without complaint, every version of myself that made the company's success look effortless, some part of it was still the 24-year-old girl trying to prove she was worth the trouble of loving, even though the family she was trying to prove it to had already stopped watching years before. I met Daniel Reyes when I was 31, at an industry conference in Austin, a structural engineer who had left a large firm to start his own small consultancy specializing in sustainable building materials, a man who, I would learn over the following months, had grown up the youngest of 5 children in a loud, warm, imperfect family that had never once made him feel he needed to earn his place at their table. He asked me to dinner after I gave a talk on Foundry Line's origins, a talk in which I had, for the first time publicly, mentioned the accident and the recovery, though I still kept the details of my family carefully vague. Our first few months were, I am embarrassed to admit now, defined almost entirely by my inability to simply receive his attention without immediately looking for the catch. He would bring me soup when I was sick, and I would feel a flare of suspicion, waiting for him to mention some favor he'd need in return. He would ask about my day, genuinely, patiently, and I would give him the efficient, managed answers I'd spent a lifetime giving people who I assumed only wanted the version of me that required nothing from them. It was Daniel, gently, over dinner one night, nearly a year into our relationship, who finally named what he'd been watching. "You flinch," he told me, "every time I do something nice for you. Like you're waiting for the invoice." He was not accusing me. His voice was soft, careful. The voice of a man who had clearly thought hard about how to say something true without making it sound like a criticism. "I'm not going to send you one, Emma. I don't love you because you're useful. I love you because you're you. And I would love you exactly as much if Foundry Line failed tomorrow and you never built anything again." I cried harder that night than I had cried at any point during my recovery, harder than I had cried reading my grandfather's letter, because some deeply buried part of me had never, not once in 31 years, heard a sentence like that and believed it was true. Daniel and I have been together for 3 years now. We are not married. We have talked about it. Unhurried. The way two people talk about a future they both trust will happen without needing to force its timeline. And he has become, alongside Salvatore and Priya, and, more recently, my mother and Chloe and Harper, part of the family I built for myself out of people who chose me, rather than the family I was simply assigned to by an accident of birth. I tell this part of the story not because it resolves neatly into the business narrative that surrounds it, but because I think it is, in some ways, the truest measure of everything that changed in me after Meadow Ridge. Building a company proved to me that I was capable. Loving Daniel and slowly, carefully, learning to let myself be loved by him without flinching, taught me something my family never managed to teach me across 34 years, that I was always, from the very beginning, worthy of showing up for. Not because of what I built, or survived, or overcame, but simply, completely, because I existed. That lesson took longer to learn than any spinal cord ever took to heal. I am, even now, still learning it, one unguarded moment at a time. I have mentioned my grandfather's workshop a few times in this story, and I want to slow down and give it the space it deserves, because I think it is the key to understanding why his letter, when it finally reached me, did not feel like a surprise so much as a confirmation of something I had always quietly hoped was true. Walter Whitfield's workshop sat behind his and my grandmother's house in Golden, Colorado, a converted garage lined with steel shelving, blueprints pinned to corkboards, and a drafting table he still used well into his 70s, long after every other engineer his age had switched entirely to computer modeling. He believed, stubbornly, that a person's hands needed to understand a structure before their software did, and every summer, from the time I was 7 years old until I was 17, I spent at least one afternoon a week in that workshop, sitting on an old wooden stool while he explained things to me that no one else in my family had the patience or the interest to sit still for. He taught me load distribution using a bridge made of popsicle sticks when I was 8, patiently rebuilding it 3 times after I intentionally overloaded it just to watch it collapse, laughing every time, never once telling me to stop wasting materials, only asking, each time, what I thought had gone wrong and what I would change. He taught me to read blueprints when I was 11, unrolling actual project plans from Whitfield and Sons across his drafting table, and quizzing me on load-bearing walls until I could identify them faster than most of his own junior engineers. He taught me, when I was 14, how to calculate a simple return on investment, using his own retirement portfolio as a live example, walking me through compound interest with the same patient rigor he applied to steel tolerances. Tyler was invited to the workshop exactly twice in all those years, both times for what my grandfather called the important stuff. Signing paperwork related to his eventual inheritance of the company, ceremonial visits rather than educational ones. Chloe was never invited at all. My grandfather, in one of the only moments of his that I would now, with adult eyes, describe as genuinely unkind, once told her, when she asked to come along one summer, that the workshop wasn't really her kind of thing, a judgment based entirely on her having once complained about getting sawdust on a new dress, and I have wondered, in the years since, whether that offhand dismissal shaped some part of the woman my sister became, beautiful, admired, and quietly convinced that substance was a category she'd been excluded from before she ever got the chance to prove otherwise. I did not understand, as a child, that those Saturday afternoons were unusual. I assumed every grandfather did this with every granddaughter, that this was simply what family was. And it was not until I was much older, comparing notes with friends whose own grandparents barely knew their names, that I understood how rare and deliberate his attention had actually been. The last time I sat in that workshop, I was 20 years old, home from community college for a weekend, and my grandfather, then 79, was slower than he had been, his hands trembling slightly over the drafting table in a way that frightened me more than I let on. He was showing me a set of plans for a small addition he was designing, unofficially, for a neighbor who couldn't afford a real architect. And partway through explaining a structural detail, he stopped, looked at me for a long moment, and said something I did not fully understand until I read his letter 14 years later. "You know, Emma," he said, "your father built his whole life believing that this company was a birthright. I let him believe that because it was easier, and because I loved him, and because a man needs something to hold on to when he's spent his whole life in his father's shadow. But birthrights and understanding are not the same thing, and I have watched, for 20 years now, exactly which of my grandchildren actually understands what I built, versus which of them simply expects to inherit it." He tapped the blueprint between us. "Don't ever let anyone convince you that paying close attention is a small thing, Mija. It is the rarest thing in the world. Rarer than money. Rarer than charm. If you keep doing it, really doing it, the way you're doing it right now, you will end up owning more of this world than anyone who was simply handed a piece of it." He died 18 months later, before I turned 22, and I remember standing at his funeral, watching my father deliver a eulogy about legacy and hard work and family, and feeling a grief so total it seemed to hollow out my chest, without any understanding, yet, of exactly how carefully my grandfather had already made sure that some part of him would keep watching over me long after he was gone. I think about that afternoon in the workshop more than almost any other memory I carry. I think about it especially now, running Walter Grove Holdings, sitting in board meetings where I still, instinctively, look for the load-bearing walls before I look at anything else, still find myself explaining return on investment to junior engineers with the same patient rigor he once used on a 14-year-old girl nobody else in the family thought was worth the time. I did not tell you earlier about the last thing my brother tried before that Friday deadline, because I wanted you to understand the full shape of the offer and its acceptance before circling back to something that still, honestly, makes my jaw tighten when I think about it. 2 days before the Friday deadline, the same week my father's attorneys were reviewing my offer, the same week Tyler had accused me on the phone of enjoying his humiliation. Tyler contacted the bank's loan officer directly, without my knowledge, and without informing our own family's attorneys, in an attempt to negotiate an alternative refinancing structure that would have bypassed my trust shares entirely, using, as collateral, a piece of undeveloped land the company owned outside Colorado Springs that Tyler apparently believed was worth significantly more than its actual appraised value. I learned about this not through any dramatic discovery, but through the loan officer herself, a careful, professional woman named Margaret Sue, who called Renata directly, a call Renata forwarded to me within the hour, specifically because Tyler's proposal had raised enough red flags in her own due diligence that she wanted to confirm, before proceeding any further, whether the family's ownership situation was actually as unified as Tyler had represented it to be. It was not, of course, unified at all. Tyler had told Margaret Sue that the family expected to have the trust matter resolved internally, and that the bank didn't need to wait on Emma Whitfield's decision. A characterization that was, at best, a significant overstatement of where things actually stood, and at worst, a deliberate attempt to pressure the bank into moving forward on his terms before I could finalize my own. I called Tyler directly that evening, and I want to be honest that I was angrier in that phone call than I had allowed myself to be at the Sunday dinner, because the dinner had at least been conducted in the open, in a room where everyone could see and hear exactly what was being asked and offered. This was different. This was Tyler, quietly, behind my back, trying to root around the one piece of leverage I had spent 34 years never once being allowed to hold, using undeveloped land he did not fully understand the value of, betting the entire company's survival on a bluff, because some old, wounded part of him could not tolerate the reality of his younger sister holding more power over the family business than he did. "You could have destroyed the deal," I told him, my voice shaking with an anger I rarely let myself express so directly. "If Margaret Sue had taken your proposal seriously and structured something around it, and it had fallen through because that land isn't worth what you think it is, the bank would have pulled the entire credit line before my offer even had a chance to close. 412 employees, Tyler. You almost gambled their jobs on a bluff because you couldn't stand watching me hold the winning hand for once." There was a long silence on the line, and when Tyler finally spoke, his voice had lost the defensive edge it usually carried around me. "I don't know how to be the person who isn't in charge, Emma," he said quietly. "I've spent my whole life being told I was going to run that company. I don't know who I am if I'm not that." It was, I think, the most honest thing my brother had ever said to me, and it did not excuse what he'd done, but it explained it in a way that shifted something in how I understood him going forward. Not as a villain exactly, but as another person shaped by the same broken hierarchy that had shaped me, just standing on the opposite side of its damage, having spent his whole life being told he was worth everything, only to discover, all at once, in his late 20s, that the worth had never been real, had only ever been a role he'd been cast in before he was old enough to consent to playing it. I did not report the incident to my father. I handled it directly with Margaret Sue myself, clarifying the actual state of the ownership negotiation, and the refinancing proceeded, in the end, exactly according to the terms I had structured. But I made it clear to Tyler in that same phone call that if anything like it happened again, any attempt to go around me, to undermine an agreement before it was finalized, to bet the company's survival on his own wounded pride, the offer would be withdrawn entirely, permanently, and I would let Whitfield and Sons face the bank's deadline without me. He never tried anything like it again. I do not know if that is growth or simply fear, and I have decided in the year since that it does not matter enormously which one it is, as long as the 412 families depending on that company continue to have jobs to go to every morning. There is one more piece of the settlement story I have not yet told you, because it happened quietly, almost a footnote to everything else, and yet it taught me something about my own family that no amount of financial forensics ever could. As part of the personal injury claim against the delivery company, I was required, roughly 10 months after the accident, to sit for a deposition, a formal, recorded interview conducted by the delivery company's insurance attorneys, meant to establish the facts of the crash and the extent of my injuries for the purposes of settlement negotiations. I was still at Meadow Ridge at the time, and the deposition was conducted in a small conference room at the facility, myself in a wheelchair at the head of the table, my father's attorney beside me, and two insurance company lawyers across from us with a court reporter typing quietly at the end of the table. My father was required to be present, as the person who had initially retained the attorney on my behalf, and who had witnessed portions of my recovery firsthand, though his testimony that day was limited to a handful of procedural questions about my medical care and living situation. I remember watching him answer those questions, watching him describe, in clipped, professional language, the ongoing care arrangements the family had made for me. The phrase he used, verbatim, for Meadow Ridge, a facility he had by then visited exactly once, in a parking lot, to sign paperwork, rather than to see his daughter. The insurance attorney, a woman named Patricia Reyes Munoz who had clearly done her homework, asked my father a question that has stayed with me for 10 years, not because of what it revealed about the case, but because of what it revealed about him. "Mr. Whitfield," she asked, "how frequently would you say you visit your daughter here at the facility?" There was a pause I felt more than saw, sitting beside him in my wheelchair, close enough to notice the small, involuntary tightening in his jaw. "As often as the business allows," he said. "It's been a difficult year for the company, with a major project underway, but we stay in close contact." Patricia Reyes Munoz did not push further because it was not relevant to the case at hand, whether the driver had been negligent, whether my injuries were as severe as documented. But I remember sitting there in that small conference room, understanding for the first time, with a clarity the beige walls of Meadow Ridge had somehow shielded me from until that exact moment, that my father was capable of describing 11 months of near-total absence as staying in close contact, under oath, in a room with a court reporter typing down every word, without so much as a flicker of visible shame. I did not confront him about it that day. I was 24, recovering, dependent on him for the legal representation that would fund the years of care still ahead of me, and some old, deeply worn part of me still believed, even then, that confronting him directly would cost me more than staying silent would. But I remember, very clearly, the exact moment my understanding of my family shifted from hurt to something closer to clear-eyed assessment. The moment I stopped believing my father's absence was a temporary lapse born of stress and started understanding it as a genuine reflection of where I ranked among his priorities. Calm enough and consistent enough that he could describe it, without hesitation, as closeness. I think about that deposition transcript sometimes. I have never requested a copy of it, though I could. It exists somewhere in a law firm's archived files. My father's exact words preserved, under oath, for as long as records like that are kept. I do not need to read it again. I remember the sentence exactly. As often as the business allows. I have built the last 10 years of my life in more ways than I fully realized until I sat down to tell this story, in careful, deliberate opposition to that sentence, making sure that in my own company, in my own relationships, in the family I have built from people who chose me, love is never something rationed out only as often as convenience allows. I want to tell you about the first time someone said yes to me, because I think it matters as much as any of the larger milestones in this story, and because I have never told it publicly before. It was 8 months after I moved into the apartment above the laundromat, a year and a half after the accident, and I had spent that entire time building small websites for local businesses, earning just enough to cover rent and the growing pile of medical bills insurance hadn't fully absorbed. I had by then started sketching the early ideas that would eventually become Foundry Line, but I had no funding, no team, no credibility in an industry that had never seen my name on anything more significant than an invoice. I made a list of 40 small and mid-sized construction firms in the Denver metro area, most of them companies I recognized from my years doing bookkeeping for my father, competitors of Whitfield and Sons who I knew, from years of overhearing my father complain about them at dinner, had many of the same operational headaches he did. I offered each of them a free 3-month trial of the earliest, roughest version of Foundry Line's change order tracking tool, cold emailing owners and operations managers from an account under the name Emma Hale, with no mention of my last name, no mention of my father's company, no credentials beyond a single working prototype, and a promise that I understood their specific frustrations better than the enterprise software companies, charging them thousands of dollars a month for tools that didn't fit their size. 37 of those 40 emails were never answered. 2 politely declined, one citing a recent bad experience with an unrelated startup that had promised similarly and failed to deliver. The 40th email reached a woman named Carol Jimenez, the owner of a mid-sized commercial framing company in Aurora, a company with about 60 employees that had been struggling, as she put it in her reply, with change orders that live in 3 different people's trucks and never make it to the same spreadsheet. She agreed to a video call, conducted from my apartment with the laundromat's dryers rumbling faintly through the floor below, and after 20 minutes of watching me demonstrate the prototype on my aging laptop, she said the 4 words that changed the entire trajectory of my life. Okay, let's try it. I did not cry until after the call ended, sitting alone at my card table desk, my hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with nerve damage. It was the first time in the entire year and a half since the accident that another human being, someone with no obligation to me, no family tie, no reason to say yes except that the thing I had built actually seemed useful to her, had looked at what I created and simply, plainly, believed in it enough to try. Carol Jimenez's company became Foundry Line's very first customer. She did not pay for those first 3 months, as promised, but at the end of the trial she called me again, this time to ask what it would cost to keep using it permanently, and I named a number: $300 a month, a figure so small I am almost embarrassed by it now, sitting inside a company worth over $100 million. And she agreed without negotiating, and told me, at the end of that call, something I have carried with me every single day since. You built something that actually understands what it's like on my end, she said. That's rarer than people think. Don't let anyone talk you into making it more complicated than it needs to be, just because they think complicated looks more impressive. Carol Jimenez's company is still a Foundry Line customer today, 9 years later, one of our longest-standing relationships, and every year, on the anniversary of that first video call, I sent her a handwritten note. Not an email, an actual card, the same kind my grandfather used to slip me birthday money in, thanking her for being the first person outside a beige rehabilitation facility to say yes to me when I had absolutely nothing to offer her except a rough prototype and a stubborn, quiet conviction that I understood a problem worth solving. I think about that yes constantly, especially in the years since it multiplied into 400 paying customers, then 412 of my own father's employees relying on a company I now controlled. Every large thing I have learned is built from a single small yes that somebody, somewhere, was brave enough to give a stranger nobody else had bothered to believe in yet. I try every day to be that kind of yes for someone else, because I remember too clearly what it felt like to need one and receive only silence. I want to tell you about something my mother told me nearly a year after that Sunday dinner, on one of our now regular phone calls, because it complicated a story I had for 10 years, allowed myself to tell in simpler terms than the truth actually deserved. We were talking, that evening, about Meadow Ridge, a subject we had both, by unspoken agreement, avoided directly for most of that first year of rebuilding, when my mother, her voice unsteady, told me something I had never known. In month 5 of my stay there, she said, she had driven out to the facility on a Tuesday afternoon without telling my father, intending to sit with me for a few hours the way she used to before the visits thinned out, only to find, upon arriving in the parking lot, that she could not make herself walk through the front doors. I sat out there for almost 40 minutes, she told me, her voice breaking. I could see the building. I knew which window was probably close to your room. And I couldn't do it, Emma. I was so ashamed of how long it had been, so afraid of what your face would look like when you saw me, so certain you'd be right to be angry, that I just sat there in the car until I convinced myself it would be worse to show up unprepared than to wait for a better time. And then I drove home, and I told myself I'd go back the following week, properly, with a plan. And then the following week became a month, and the month became... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I sat with that story for a long time after we hung up that night, turning it over, trying to understand what I actually felt about it. I want to be honest that my first reaction was not compassion. My first reaction was a fresh, sharp flare of anger. The specific anger of learning that the person who abandoned you had, at one point, been close enough to stop, had been sitting in a parking lot 40 minutes from ending 11 months of unbearable isolation, and had chosen, instead, to drive home and let the silence continue. But I have sat with it longer since, and I have come to understand it as something more complicated than either villainy or excuse, a genuinely human failure, the kind that shame produces in ordinary people every single day, the particular paralysis of having let a gap grow so wide that closing it starts to feel more frightening than leaving it open. It does not erase what happened. It does not, in my accounting, meaningfully reduce her responsibility for those 11 months. But it taught me something about the specific mechanics of how families fail each other that I had not fully understood before. That abandonment is rarely one single decision, made cleanly and permanently. It is usually hundreds of smaller decisions, each one slightly easier than the last, each one a little further from the parking lot, until the person on the other side of that door has become, without anyone quite intending it, a stranger. I told my mother that night that I was glad she'd finally told me, and that I understood, better than I once had, how shame can calcify into distance faster than almost any other emotion. I did not tell her it made everything all right, because it did not. And I have learned that the truest gift you can give someone you are slowly rebuilding trust with is honesty about exactly how far that trust has actually traveled, rather than a comforting overstatement neither of you actually believes. We have talked about that parking lot several times since, in the careful, ongoing way we talk about most of those 11 months now. Not as a single closed subject, resolved and filed away, but as a wound we are both, slowly and imperfectly, learning to tend to, honestly, together, for the first time in either of our lives. The documents closed on a Wednesday, 3 days after that Friday deadline, and the following Monday, I stood in front of Whitfield & Sons' entire workforce for the first time in my life, not as the bookkeeper's daughter who used to reconcile invoices down the hall from my father's office, but as the woman who now owned 51% of the company that employed them. Grace Okafor had organized the gathering in the largest warehouse bay at the company's main equipment yard, the only space large enough to hold 412 people at once, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows between stacked pallets of lumber and steel decking, the smell of diesel and sawdust hanging in the air in a way that instantly, viscerally, took me back to summer afternoons visiting job sites with my grandfather as a child, watching him talk to crews with a respect that never once talked down to them. I had written a speech for that morning, 3 separate drafts, each one discarded because it sounded, on rereading, too much like the kind of corporate reassurance speech I had sat through at industry conferences over the years, full of phrases like synergy and exciting new chapter, that meant nothing to a framer worried about whether his paycheck would clear next month. I threw out the 3rd draft entirely at 6 in the morning and decided, standing in front of the mirror in my apartment, that I would simply tell them the truth. the same way I had learned to tell Harper the truth, in language sized to what the moment actually required. I told them my name, not Emma Hale, the name most of the room recognized from industry news about Foundry Line, but Emma Whitfield, my grandfather's name, spoken out loud in that building for the first time in my adult life. I told them I had grown up watching this company from the edges of my own family's dinner table, that I understood exactly how hard the work in that warehouse bay actually was, because I had spent years doing the books that tracked every single hour of it. I told them the company had come dangerously close to collapse, and I did not pretend the crisis away or minimize how serious it had been, because I have never believed that people deserve to be managed with half-truths, especially not people whose mortgages depended on the whole one. And then I told them what had changed, and why. I told them the company's ownership had shifted, that I now held controlling interest, and that my first priority, not my only priority, but the first one, the one I wanted them to hear before anything else, was that every single job in that room would still exist a year from now, structured around a recovery plan that did not depend on underbidding contracts we couldn't afford to deliver, or gambling the company's survival on projects too large for our current capacity to handle safely. I told them about the Walter Whitfield Engineering Fellowship, the scholarship fund I was establishing that day for their children, and I watched, from the small raised platform where I stood, a wave of visible surprise move through the room. People glancing at each other, a few visibly emotional, one older foreman near the back, wiping his eyes with the back of a work glove in a way he clearly hoped nobody would notice. After the gathering, a woman approached me, Yolanda Reyes, a site supervisor who had worked for Whitfield and Sons for 19 years, since before I was born, who told me she had worked directly under my grandfather in the company's earlier years and had wondered, for a long time, what had happened to the granddaughter she remembered visiting job sites as a child, always with a notebook, always asking more careful questions than either of her siblings ever had. Your grandfather used to say you were the only one of you three who ever really looked at the work, she told me, echoing, almost word for word, something Harold Voss had told me weeks earlier. I'm glad the company finally ended up with someone who understands that looking is the whole job. Everything else is just details. I did not tell the room that morning about the 11 months at Meadow Ridge, about the trust liquidated without my consent, about the settlement money folded silently into a construction loan. Some truths belong to the people who lived through them and the people they choose to share them with, not to a warehouse bay full of employees who needed, that morning, only to know that their jobs were safe and that the person now steering the company understood exactly what steering it actually required. But I felt, standing on that small platform, surrounded by 412 faces that had nothing to do with my family's private failures, and everything to do with my grandfather's original, uncomplicated dream. A truck, a toolbox, a company built to last. Something settle into place that felt less like triumph and more like arrival. The sense of a circle finally closing exactly where it always should have. People sometimes ask me, in interviews about Foundry Line, what kind of company culture I set out to build, and I have learned, over the years, to give a shorter answer than the true one, because the true one takes longer than most interviewers have time for. But I want to give the full answer here, because I think it is the clearest possible window into what those 11 months at Meadow Ridge actually taught me, beyond survival, beyond the physical recovery, beyond even the business itself. Foundry Line has, from its earliest days, operated on a small set of policies that I wrote myself, in the first year, before we had more than a dozen employees, and that I have refused to compromise on, even as the company has grown into something far larger than that early version of myself could have imagined. Every employee, regardless of tenure or role, is entitled to unlimited paid time off for family medical emergencies. Not the standard, grudging bereavement policy most companies offer, but genuine, unquestioned time. Because I remember, vividly, exactly what it costs a person to lie in a hospital bed, wondering whether their absence will cost someone else something they cannot afford to lose. I built that policy the year the company was profitable enough to afford it, and I have kept it every year since, through funding rounds where board members occasionally raised an eyebrow at the cost, because I have never once regretted a policy built to make sure no employee's family member experiences what mine experienced. Every manager at Foundry Line is required, as part of their onboarding, to spend 1 full week working alongside our customer support team, answering calls directly from construction site supervisors frustrated by a bug or confused by a feature. Because I never want anyone in a leadership position at my company to become so insulated by their own success that they forget what it feels like to be the person on the other end of a system that isn't working for them. I learned that lesson, I think, from watching my own father grow so comfortable behind his executive desk that he forgot what it felt like to be a person waiting for a phone call that never came. And every year, on the anniversary of the accident, a date I have never announced publicly, that exists only as a quiet, internal company holiday I call Foundation Day, though few employees know the specific reason behind its name. Foundry Line closes for the day, and every employee receives full pay to spend that day however they choose, with the only requirement being a company-wide optional gathering in the evening where anyone who wants to share something about resilience, about a hard year they came back from, about a person who showed up for them when it mattered, is given the space and the microphone to do it. I started Foundation Day, the first year Foundry Line turned a profit, 4 years after the accident, and I remember standing up at that first small gathering, 11 employees, a rented conference room, sandwiches from the deli downstairs, and telling them, for the first time, a carefully edited version of the story you are hearing now. I did not use my family's name. I did not mention Whitfield and Sons. I simply told them about a woman in a hospital bed who lost everyone she thought would show up for her, and found, instead, a stranger with a tablet, and an old man in room 114, and a tenacity she did not know she had until she had no other choice but to find it. A junior developer named Marcus, who had joined the company only 3 months earlier, came up to me afterward, his eyes wet, and told me his own mother had walked out on his family when he was 12, and that he had spent 15 years believing something was fundamentally unlovable about him, some flaw that had made her leave, and that, hearing my story, hearing that abandonment sometimes says everything about the person leaving and nothing at all about the person left, had cracked something open in him that 15 years of quiet shame had never managed to touch. That, I think, is the real thing Foundry Line became, underneath the software, underneath the balance sheets, underneath the acquisition of my own father's company. It became a place built, brick by brick, policy by policy, out of every single thing I wished someone had given me during those 11 months, and in giving it to other people, I have found something that no amount of professional success on its own could ever have provided. Proof that the pain could be transformed into something other than bitterness, that it could become, instead, a kind of fluency, an ability to recognize exactly what another struggling person needs, because I once needed exactly that, and did not receive it from the people who were supposed to give it to me first. There is one more milestone I want to tell you about before I close this story, because it belongs, I think, more than almost anything else, to the part of me that started in that hospital bed, rather than the part of me that eventually sat across a boardroom table from my father. 6 years after the accident, The same year Foundry Line closed its Series A funding round, I registered for the Colfax Marathon's half-marathon distance, 13.1 miles, run every May through the streets of Denver, on a course that, in a detail I did not choose consciously but recognized immediately once I saw the route map, passed within 4 blocks of the intersection where the crash had happened. My physical therapists at the time thought I was, in their careful clinical phrasing, setting an ambitious goal, which I understood to mean they thought I was not fully being realistic about what my body, still carrying 2 titanium rods and permanent nerve damage in my left leg, was actually capable of. I trained anyway, for 8 months, in the early mornings before Foundry Line's daily crises began, running slow, uneven miles through my neighborhood with a limp that never fully disappeared no matter how much strength I built around it. Some mornings crying from the pain before I'd even finished the first mile. Other mornings feeling something close to joy at simply being a body in motion, moving forward under its own power, after 2 years of wondering whether that would ever be possible again. Salvatore came to watch, in a wheelchair of his own by then, positioned by his home health aide near the finish line on Colfax Avenue, holding a hand-lettered sign that said simply, "Maija, you already won the hard part." And I remember seeing that sign from nearly a block away, through legs that had gone numb with exhaustion somewhere around mile 11, and finding, from somewhere I did not know I still had access to, the strength to run the last stretch instead of walking it. I finished in 3 hours and 41 minutes, a time that would mean nothing to a competitive runner and meant, to me, more than almost any business milestone I have achieved before or since. I crossed the finish line 4 blocks from the intersection where a delivery truck had run a red light and changed the entire shape of my life, and I stood there, metal around my neck, sobbing in a way I had not allowed myself to sob since the night I first stood up unassisted to reach Dolores's bedside, while Salvatore wheeled himself toward me as fast as his aide could push him, and Daniel. We had been together only 4 months at that point, early enough that I had not yet told him the full story of my family, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and held me without asking a single question, understanding somehow that this particular finish line required silence more than words. I have run that same half marathon every year since, 6 times now, my time slowly improving despite the permanent damage in my leg, each year a small private ritual of proving something to nobody but myself, that the 24-year-old girl who once believed, in her darkest month at Meadow Ridge, that stopping might simply be easier than continuing, had been wrong. That the body broken on Colfax Avenue had not only survived, but had learned, mile by difficult mile, to carry her exactly as far as she needed to go. I did not tell my family about the marathon for the first 3 years I ran it. When my mother finally learned about it, during one of our rebuilding phone calls in the year after the Sunday dinner, she was quiet for a long moment before asking, in a voice thick with something I understood, by then, as genuine grief for everything she had missed, whether she could come watch someday. I told her yes. She has come the last 2 years, standing beside Salvatore's wheelchair near the finish line, and last year, Harper stood with her, holding a sign of her own that she had made with markers and glitter glue, misspelling unstoppable in a way that made me laugh through my exhaustion at mile 13, and I crossed that finish line surrounded, for the first time, by people who had actually shown up. Not because I needed them to prove anything, not because their presence changed the outcome of the race, but because showing up, I have come to understand, was never actually about the outcome at all. It was always simply about being there, about choosing freely to stand at the finish line for someone you love, instead of deciding, quietly and gradually, that the drive wasn't worth making. I want to end this story with something small, almost silly, that I have never told anyone outside my closest circle, because I think it captures, better than any balance sheet or boardroom confrontation, the actual shape of what healing has felt like for me. 2 years ago, walking through a garden center with Daniel on a quiet Saturday, I stopped in front of a small carved wooden statue of a panda, sitting placidly among a display of garden ornaments, and found myself unable to walk away from it. Daniel asked, gently amused, why a construction software CEO, who had never once expressed interest in garden decor, was suddenly transfixed by a wooden panda, and I did not have a good answer for him at the time, beyond a strange, quiet pull I couldn't fully explain. I bought it. It sits now in the small garden behind the house Daniel and I share, and I have come, in the 2 years since, to understand exactly why it caught me the way it did. Pandas, I have read since, appear placid, slow-moving, almost comically unbothered by a world that moves faster and more aggressively around them. They are not predators. They do not fight for territory the way other bears do. And yet they are, pound for pound, extraordinarily strong, capable of snapping bamboo stalks with a bite force that would surprise anyone who only ever saw their gentle, unhurried exterior. They survive not by matching the aggression of a competitive world, but by moving calmly through it, taking exactly what they need, protecting what matters to them without ever needing to prove their strength to anyone who doubts it. I think that is who I became. Somewhere in the 10 years between that hospital bed and the dinner table, where I finally told my father the truth. I did not become someone loud. I did not become someone vengeful or bitter or interested in spectacle. I became someone calm, unbothered on the surface, by the doubts of people who had once decided I was too inconvenient to show up for, while underneath that calm, I built something extraordinarily strong, patiently, quietly, one bamboo stalk at a time, until the day came when the people who doubted me needed exactly what I had built, and discovered, all at once, precisely how much strength had been sitting there the entire time, unnoticed, because nobody had ever bothered to look closely enough to see it. I do not know, even now, whether my father and I will ever have the relationship I once wished for as a child. The uncomplicated, unconditional kind. The kind Chloe is slowly, carefully learning to build with Harper. The kind Daniel grew up inside without ever having to fight for it. I have made a kind of peace with the possibility that we will not, that some wounds close enough to stop bleeding without ever fully disappearing, and that this, too, is a legitimate way for a story to end, not with total reconciliation, but with total self-respect, which I have come to believe is very often the more valuable of the two. What I know for certain is this. The woman who once filled ice buckets at her sister's engagement party because nobody else had noticed it was empty does not exist anymore. She died, in a way, on Colfax Avenue on a rain-soaked October night, and something new and unfamiliar was born in that hospital bed over the 11 months that followed. Something that had to learn, alone, in a beige room with bad food, that her own hands were enough to hold herself up, long before anyone else ever offered to. If you are listening to this and you recognize some piece of yourself in it, if you have ever been the middle child, the overlooked one, the daughter or the wife or the sister who filled the ice bucket while everyone else took the credit, I want you to hear the only piece of advice I would ever presume to give. Do not wait for the door to open. Build something so extraordinary, so entirely your own, that when the door finally does open, and it will, because doors like that always eventually do, you are the one who gets to decide whether you still want to walk through it. Sometimes the greatest revenge really is exactly what it sounds like from the outside. A woman who stopped waiting and started building and became, quietly, unstoppably, herself. I think, often, about how differently this story might have ended if I had simply stayed angry, if I had let the 11 months at Meadow Ridge calcify into the kind of bitterness that hardens a person from the inside out, closing them off from every stranger's kindness, every second chance, every fragile, unlikely yes. I understand that impulse completely. I do not judge anyone who has lived through their own version of abandonment and found themselves reaching for anger as the only tool sturdy enough to hold the weight of it. Anger is honest. Anger is, in its own way, a form of self-respect, a refusal to pretend that what happened to you was acceptable. But I have learned, in the 10 years since that hospital bed, that anger makes an excellent foundation and a terrible house. It can tell you, with total clarity, that something was wrong, that you deserved better, that the people who failed you bear real responsibility for that failure. What it cannot do, no matter how long you live inside it, is build you a life. For that, I needed something quieter and more patient, the willingness to learn one new skill at a time on a borrowed tablet, the willingness to trust a stranger's $11,000, the willingness to stand up alone in the dark for someone who needed my hand more than I needed to stay resentfully still. I do not know what specific shape your own story takes, whether it is a family like mine, or a marriage, or a friendship you gave everything to and received scraps in return. But I have come to believe, with more certainty than I have about almost anything else in my life, that the people who hurt you rarely get the reckoning you imagine for them in your angriest moments, and that waiting for that particular reckoning is its own kind of captivity. What you can control, always, no matter how thoroughly you have been let down, is what you choose to build next, and who you choose to become while you are building it. Build that. Build it slowly if you have to. Build it in a beige room with bad food on a borrowed tablet, with nobody watching and no guarantee it will ever amount to anything. Build it anyway. I promise you, from the other side of 11 months I once thought I would not survive, that it is worth every quiet, unglamorous hour it costs you. And if, somewhere down the road, the people who once left you behind come back through a door you no longer need them to walk through, you will find, if you have done the slow work of building a life entirely your own, that you finally have a choice you never had before. Not the choice of whether they get to matter to you again, but the far more powerful choice of deciding, calmly and on your own terms, exactly how much. That choice, more than the company, more than the money, more than the 22% my grandfather quietly set aside for a granddaughter he understood better than anyone else in our family ever did, is the truest inheritance I carry forward from everything that happened. Nobody can take it from me now. Nobody can leave me somewhere and take it away either. It is simply, finally, completely mine, and it always will be. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, I hope you carry a piece of it with you. Not the anger, but the panda's calm. The kind of strength that never needs to raise its voice to be undeniable.